Chapter 19. Night brought little sleep to Cleopatra. Memory followed memory. Plan was added to plan. The resolve made the day before was the right one. Today she would begin its execution. Whatever might happen, she was prepared for every contingency. Ere she went to her work, she granted a second audience to the Roman envoy. Timagenes exerted all his powers of eloquence, skill in persuasion, wit, and ingenuity. He again promised to Cleopatra life and liberty, and to her children the throne. But when he insisted upon the surrender or death of Mark Antony as the first condition of any further negotiations, Cleopatra remained steadfast, and the ambassador set forth on his way home without any pledge. After he had gone, the Queen and Iris looked over the plans for the tomb brought by Gorgias, but the intense agitation of her soul distracted Cleopatra's attention, and she begged him to come again at a later hour. When she was alone, she took out the letters which Caesar and Antony had written to her. How acute, subtle, and tender were those of the former! How ardent, impassioned, yet sincere were those of the mighty and fiery orator, whose eloquence swept the listening multitudes with him, yet whom her little hand had drawn wherever she desired. Her heart throbbed faster when she thought of the meeting with Antony, now close at hand, for Charmian had gone with the Nubian to invite him to join her again. They had started several hours ago, and she awaited their return with increasing impatience. She had summoned him for their last mutual battle. That he would come she did not doubt, but could she succeed in rekindling his courage? Two persons so closely allied should sink and perish, still firmly united in the final battle, if victory was denied. Archibius was now announced. It soothed her merely to gaze into the faithful countenance which recalled so many of her happiest memories. She opened her whole soul to him without reserve, and he drew himself up to his full height, as if restored to youth, while when she told him that she would never sully herself by treachery to her lover and husband, and had resolved to die worthy of her name, the expression of his eyes revealed that she had chosen the right path. Ere she had made the request that he should undertake the education and guidance of the children, he voluntarily proposed to devote his best powers to them. The plan of uniting Didymus's garden with the Lochias and giving it to the little ones also met with his approval. His sister had already told him that Cleopatra had determined to build her tomb. He hoped, he added, that its doors would not open to her for many years. She shook her head sorrowfully, exclaiming, "Would that I could read every face as I do yours! My friend Archibius wishes me a long life, if any one does, but he is as wise as he is faithful, and therefore will consider that earthly life is by no means a boon in every case. Besides, he says to himself, events are impending over this queen and woman, my friend, which will perhaps render it advisable to make use of the great privilege which the immortals bestow on human beings when it becomes desirable for them to leave the stage of life. So let her build her tomb. Have I read the old familiar book aright?" "On the whole, yes," he answered gravely, "but it is inscribed upon its pages that a great princess and faithful mother can be permitted to set forth on the last journey whence there is no return, only when," she interrupted, "a shameful end threatens to fall upon the fair beginning and brilliant middle period, as a swarm of locusts darkens the air and devours and devastates the fields. I know it, and will act accordingly." And, added Archibius, this end also, faithful to your nature, you will shape regally. On my way here I met my sister near the Choma. You sent her to your husband. He will grasp the proffered hand. Now that it is necessary to stake everything or surrender, the grandson of Heracles will again display his former heroic power. Perhaps, stimulated and encouraged by the example of the woman he loves, he will even force hostile fate to show him fresh favour. Destiny will pursue its course, interrupted Cleopatra firmly, but Antony must help me to heap fresh obstacles in the pathway, and when he wishes to use his giant strength, what masses of rock his mighty arm can hurl. And if your lofty spirit smooths the path for him, then, my royal mistress, even then the close of the tragedy will be death, and every scene a disappointment. Was not the plan of bringing the fleet across the isthmus bold and full of promise? Even the professional engineers greeted it with applause, and yet it proved impracticable. Destiny dug its grave, and the terrible omens before and after Actium, and the stars, everything points to speedy destruction, everything. Every hour brings news of the desertion of some prince or general. As if from a watch-tower I now overlook what is now growing from the seed I sowed, sterile ears or poisonous vegetation wherever I turn my eyes. And yet, you who know my life from its beginning, tell me, must I veil my head in shame when the question is asked, what powers of intellect, what talents, industry, and desire for good Cleopatra displayed? No, my royal mistress, 1,000 times no. Yet the fruit of every tree I planted degenerated and decayed. Caesarion is withering in the flower of his youth, by whose fault I know only too well. You will now take charge of the education of the other children, so it is for you to consider what brought me where I now stand, and how to guard their life-bark from wandering and shipwreck. Let me train them to be human beings, replied Archibius gravely, and preserve them from the desire to enter the lists with the gods, from the simple Cleopatra in the garden of Epicurus, who was a delight to the good and wise. You became the new Isis, to whom the multitude raised hearts, eyes, and hands, dazzled and blinded. We will transfer the twins, Helios and Selene, the sun and the moon, from heaven to earth. They must become mortals, Greeks. I will not transplant them to the garden of Epicurus, but to another, where the air is more bracing. The inscription on its portals shall not be, "Here pleasure is the chief good," but "This is an arena for character." He who leaves this garden shall not owe it to the yearning for happiness and comfort, but an immovably steadfast moral discipline. Your children, like yourself, were born in the East, which loves what is monstrous, superhuman, exaggerated. If you entrust them to me, they must learn to govern themselves. At the helm stands moral earnestness, which, however, does not exclude the joyous cheerfulness natural to our people. The sails will be trimmed by moderation, the noblest quality of the Greek nation. I understand, Cleopatra interrupted with drooping head. Interwoven with the means of securing the children's welfare, you set before the mother's eyes the qualities she has lacked. I know that long ago you abandoned the teachings of Epicurus and the Stoa, and with an earnest aim before your eyes sought your own paths. The tempest of life swept me far away from the quiet garden where we sought the purest delight. Now I have learned to know the perils which threaten those who see the chief good in happiness. It stands too high for mortals, for in the changeful stir of life it remains unattainable. and yet it is too low an aim for their struggles, for there are worthier objects. Yet one saying of Epicurus we both believed, and it has always stood us in good stead: wisdom can obtain no more precious contribution to the happiness of mortal life than the possession of friendship. She held out her hand as she spoke, and while deeply agitated he raised it to his lips, she went on: "You know I am on the eve of the last desperate battle, if the gods will, shoulder to shoulder with Antony. Therefore I shall not be permitted to watch your work of education, yet I will aid it. When the children question you about their mother, you will be obliged to restrain yourself from saying, instead of striving for the painless peace of mind, the noble pleasure of Epicurus, which once seemed to her the highest good, she constantly pursued fleeting amusements. The Oriental recklessly squandered her once noble gifts of intellect, and the wealth of her people yielded to the hasty impulses of her passionate nature. But you shall also say to them, your mother's heart was full of ardent love. She scorned what was base, strove for the highest goal, and when she fell, preferred death to treachery and disgrace." Here she paused, for she thought she heard footsteps approaching, and then exclaimed anxiously, "I am waiting, expecting. Perhaps Antony cannot escape from the paralyzing grasp of despair. To fight the last battle without him, and yet under the gaze of his wrathful, gloomy eyes, once so full of sunshine, would be the greatest sorrow of my life. Archibius, I may confess this to you, the friend who saw love for this man develop in the breast of the child. But what does this mean? An uproar! Have the people rebelled? Yesterday the representatives of the priesthood, the members of the museum, and the leaders of the army assured me of their changeless fidelity and love. Dion belonged to the Macedonian men of the council, yet I have already declared, in accordance with the truth, that I never intended to persecute him on Cæsarion's account. I do not even know, and do not desire to know, the refuge of the lately wedded pair. Or has the new tax levied, the command to seize the treasures of the temple, driven them to extremities? What am I to do? We need gold to bind the foe defiance, to preserve the independence of the throne, the country, and the people. Or have tidings from Rome? It is becoming serious, and the noise is growing louder. Let me see what they want," Archibius anxiously interrupted, hastening to the door. But just at that moment the introducer opened it, crying, "Mark Antony is approaching the Lochias, attended by half Alexandria." "The noble Imperator is returning," fell from the bearded lips of the commander of the guard, ere the courtier's words had died away, and even while he spoke, Iras pressed past him, shrieking as if half frantic. "He is coming! He is here! I knew he would come! How they are shouting and cheering! Out with you, men! If you are willing, my royal mistress, we will greet him from the balcony of Berenike. If we only had—" "The twins, little Alexander," interrupted Cleopatra, with blanched face and faltering voice, "put on their festal garments." "Quick, the children, Zoe!" cried Iras, completing the order and clapping her hands. Then she turned to the Queen with the entreaty, "Be calm, my royal mistress! Be calm, I beseech you! We have ample time. Here is the vulture crown of Isis, and here the other. Antony's slave, Eros, has just come in, panting for breath. The Imperator, he says, will appear as the new Dionysus. It would certainly please his master, though he had not commissioned him to request it, if you greeted him as the new Isis. Help me, Hathor. Nephoris, tell the usher to see that the fan-bearers and the other attendants, women and men, are in their places. Here are the pearl and diamond necklaces for your throat and bosom. Take care of the robe. The transparent bombyx is as delicate as a cobweb, and if you tear it— No, you must not refuse. We all know how it pleases him to see his goddess in divine majesty and beauty." Cleopatra, with glowing cheeks and throbbing heart, made no further objection to donning the superb festal robe, strewn with glimmering pearls and glittering gems. It would have been more in harmony with her feelings to meet the returning Antony in the plain, dark garb which, since her arrival at home, she had exchanged for a richer one only on festal occasions. But Antony was coming as the new Dionysus, and Eros knew what would please his master. 8 nimble hands, which were often aided by Iras's skilful fingers, toiled busily, and soon the latter could hold up the mirror before Cleopatra, exclaiming from the very depths of her heart, like the foam-born Aphrodite and the golden Hathor. Then Iras, who in adorning her beloved mistress had forgotten love, hate, and envy, and amid her eager haste barely found time for a brief, fervent prayer for a happy issue of this meeting, threw the broad folding doors as wide as if she were about to reveal to the worshippers in the temple the image of the god in the innermost sanctuary. A long, echoing shout of surprise and delight greeted the Queen, for the courtiers, hastily summoned, were already awaiting her without, from the grey-haired epistolograph to the youngest page. Regally attired women in her service raised the floating train of her cloak. Others, in sacerdotal robes, were testing the ease of movement of the rings on the sistrum rods. Men and boys were forming into lines according to the rank of each individual, and the chief fan-bearer gave the signal for departure. After a short walk through several halls and corridors, the train reached the first courtyard of the palace, and there ascended the few steps leading to the broad platform at the entrance gate, which overlooked the whole Bruchium and the Street of the King, down which the expected hero would approach. The distant uproar of the multitude had sounded threatening, but now, amid the deafening din, they could distinguish every shout of welcome, every joyous greeting, every expression of delight, surprise, applause, admiration, and homage known to the Greek and Egyptian tongues. Only the centre and end of the procession were visible. The head had reached the corner of the Muses, where, concealed by the old trees in the garden, it moved on between the temple of Isis and the land owned by Didymus. The end still extended to the Coma whence it had started. All Alexandria seemed to have joined it. Men, large and small, of high and low degree, old and young, the lame and the crippled, mingled with the throng sweeping onward among horses and carriages, carts and beasts of burden, like a mountain torrent dashing wildly down to the valley. Here a loud shriek rang from an overturned litter whose bearers had fallen. Yonder a child thrown to the ground screamed shrilly. There a dog trodden under the feet of the crowd howled piteously. So clear and resonant were the shouts of joy that they rose high above the flutes and tambourines, the cymbals and lutes of the musicians who followed the man approaching in the robes of a god. The head of the procession now passed beyond the corner of the Muses and came within view of the platform. There could be no doubt to whom this ovation was given, for the returning hero was in the van, high above all the other figures. From the golden throne, borne on the shoulders of 12 black slaves, he waved his long thyrsus in greeting to the exulting multitude. Before the bacchanalian train which accompanied him, and behind the musicians who followed, moved 2 elephants, bearing between them, as a light burden, some unrecognizable object covered with a purple cloth. Now the column had passed between the pylons, through the lofty gateway which separated the palace from the Street of the King, and stopped opposite to the platform. While officials, Scythians, and bodyguards of all shades of complexion, on foot and on horseback, kept back the throng by force, where friendly warning did not avail, Cleopatra saw her lover descend from the throne and give a signal to the Indian slave who guided the elephants. The cloth was flung aside, revealing to the astonished eyes of the spectators a bouquet of flowers such as no Alexandrian had ever beheld. It consisted entirely of blossoming rose bushes. The red flowers formed a circle in the centre, surrounded by a broad light garland of white ones. The whole gigantic work rested like an egg in its cup in a holder of palm fronds which, as it were, framed it in graceful curving outlines. More than 1,000 blossoms were united in this peerless bouquet, and the singular gigantic gift was characteristic of its giver. He advanced on foot to the platform, his figure towering above the brown, light-hued, and black freedmen and slaves who followed. As on the monuments of the Pharaohs, the image of the sovereign dominates those of the subjects and foes. He could look down upon the tallest men, and the width of his shoulders was as remarkable as his colossal height. A long gold-broidered purple mantle floating to his ankles increased his apparent stature. Powerful arms, with the swelling muscles of an athlete, were extended from his sleeveless robe towards the beloved Queen. The well-formed head, thick dark hair, and magnificent beard corresponded with the powerful figure. Formerly these locks had adorned the head of the youth with the blue-black hue of the raven's plumage. Now the threads of grey, scattered abundantly through them, were concealed by the aid of dye. A thick wreath of vine leaves rested on the Imperator's brow, and leafy vine branches, to which clung several dark bunches of grapes, fell over his broad shoulders and down his back, which was covered like a cloak, not by a leopard skin, but that of a royal Indian tiger of great size. He had slain it himself in the arena. The head and paws of the animal were gold, the eyes two magnificent sparkling sapphires. The clasp of the chain by which the skin was suspended, as well as that of the gold belt which circled the Imperator's body above the hips, was covered with rubies and emeralds. The wide armlets above his elbows, the ornaments on his broad breast, nay, even his red morocco boots, glittered and flashed with gems. Radiant magnificence, as his former fortunes seemed the attire of this mighty fallen hero, who but yesterday had shrunk timidly and sadly from the eyes of his fellow men. His features, too, were large, noble, and beautiful in outline, but, though his pale cheeks were adorned with the borrowed crimson of youth, half a century of the maddest pursuit of pleasure and the torturing excitement of the last few weeks had left traces only too visible, for the skin hung in loose bags beneath the large eyes. Wrinkles furrowed his brow and radiated in slanting lines from the corners of his eyes across his temples. Yet not one of those whom this bedizened man of 50 was approaching thought of seeing in him an aged, bedecked dandy. It was an instinct of his nature to surround himself with pomp and splendour, and moreover his whole appearance was so instinct with power that scorn and mockery shrank abashed before it. How frank, gracious, and kindly was this man's face! How sincere the heartfelt emotion which sparkled in his eyes, still glowing with the fire of youth at the sight of the woman from whom he had been so long parted! Every feature beamed with the most ardent tenderness for the royal wife whom he was approaching, and the expression on the lips of the giant varied so swiftly from humble, sorrowful anguish of mind to gratitude and delight that even the hearts of his foes were touched. But when, pressing his hand on his broad breast, he advanced towards the Queen, bending so low that it seemed as if he would fain kiss her feet, when in fact the colossal figure did sink kneeling before her, and the powerful arms were outstretched with fervent devotion like a child beseeching help, the woman who had loved him throughout her whole life with all the ardour of her passionate soul was overpowered by the feeling that everything which stood between them, all their mutual offences, had vanished. He saw the sunny smile that brightened her beloved, ever beautiful face, and then his own name reached his ears from the lips to which he owed the greatest bliss love had ever offered. At last, as if intoxicated by the tones of her voice, which seemed to him more musical than the songs of the Muses, half smiling at the jest which, even in the most serious earnest, he could not abandon, half moved to the depths of his soul by the power of his newly awakening happiness after such sore sorrow, he pointed to the gigantic bouquet which 3 slaves had lifted down from the elephant and were bearing to the Queen. Cleopatra, too, was overwhelmed with emotion. This floral gift imitated on an immense scale the little bouquet which the famous young general had taken from her father's hand before the gate of the garden of Epicurus to present to her as his first gift. That had also been composed of red roses surrounded by white ones. Instead of palm fronds, it had been encircled only by fern leaves. This was one of the beautiful offerings which Antony's gracious nature so well understood how to choose. The bouquet was a symbol of the unprecedented generosity natural to this large-minded man. No magic goblet had compelled him to approach her thus and with such homage. Nothing had constrained him save his overflowing heart, his constant, fadeless love. As if restored to youth, transported by some magic spell to the happy days of early girlhood, she forgot her royal dignity and the hundreds of eyes which rested upon him as if spellbound, and, obedient to an irresistible impulse of the heart, she sank upon the broad, heaving breast of the kneeling hero. Laughing joyously in the clear, silvery tones which are usually heard only in youth, he clasped her in his strong arms, raised her slender figure in its floating royal mantle from the ground, kissed her lips and eyes, held her aloft in the soaring attitude of the goddess of victory, as if to display his happiness to the eyes of all, and at last placed her carefully on her feet again like some treasured jewel. Then, turning to the children who were waiting at their mother's side, he lifted first little Alexander, then the twins, to kiss them, and while holding Helios and Selene in his arms, as if the joy of seeing them again had banished their weight, the shouts which had arisen when the Queen sank on his breast again burst forth. The ancient walls of the Lochias palace had never heard such acclamations. They passed from lip to lip, from hundreds to hundreds, and though those more distant did not know the cause, they joined in the shouts. Along the whole vast stretch from the Lochias to the Choma, the cheers rang out like a single heart-stirring, inseparable cry, echoing across the harbour, the ships lying at anchor, the towering masts to the cliff amid the sea, where Barine was nursing her new-made husband. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20. The property of the freedman Pyrrhus was a flat rock in the northern part of the harbour, scarcely larger than the garden of Didymus at the corner of the Muses, a desolate spot where neither tree nor blade of grass grew. It was called the Serpent Island, though the inhabitants had long since rid it of these dangerous guests, which lived in great numbers in the neighbouring cliffs. Not even the poorest crops would grow in soil so hostile to life, and those who chose it for a home were compelled to bring even the drinking water from the continent. This desert, around which hovered gulls, sea swallows, and sea eagles, had been for several weeks the abode of the fugitives Dion and Barine. They still occupied the 2 rooms which had been assigned to them on their arrival. During the day the sun beat fiercely down upon the yellow, chalky rock. There was no shade save in the house, and at the foot of a towering cliff in the southern part of the island, the fishermen's watch-tower. There were no works of human hands save a little temple of Poseidon, an altar of Isis, the large house owned by Pyrrhus, solidly constructed by Alexandrian masons, and a smaller one for the freedmen's married sons and their families. A long wooden frame, on which nets were strung to dry, rose on the shore. Near it, towards the north, in the open sea, was the anchorage of the larger sea-going ships and the various skiffs and boats of the fisher folk. Dionikos, Pyrrhus's youngest son, who was still unmarried, built new boats and repaired the old ones. His two strong, taciturn brothers, with their wives and children, his father Pyrrhus, his wife, and their youngest child, a daughter Dione, a few dogs, cats, and chickens, composed the population of the Serpent Island. Such were the surroundings of the newly wedded pair who had been reared in the capital. At first many things were strange to them, but they accommodated themselves to circumstances with a good grace, and both had admitted to each other long before that life had never been so equable and peaceful. During the first week Dion's wound and fever still harassed him, but the prediction of Pyrrhus that the pure, fresh sea air would benefit the sufferer had been fulfilled, and the monotonous days had passed swiftly enough to the young bride in caring for the invalid. The wife of Pyrrhus, Mother as they all called her, had proved to be a skilful nurse, and her daughters-in-law and young Dione were faithful and nimble assistants. During the time of anxiety in nursing, Barine had formed a warm friendship for them. If the taciturn men avoided using a single unnecessary word, the women were all the more ready to gossip, and it was a pleasure to talk to pretty Dione, who had grown up on the island and was eager to hear about the outside world. Dion had long since left his couch and the house, and each day looked happier, more content with himself and his surroundings. At first his feverish visions had shown him his dead mother, pointing anxiously at his new-made wife, as if to warn him against her. During his convalescence he remembered them, and they conjured up the doubt whether Barine could endure the solitude of this desolate cliff, whether she would not lose the bright serenity of soul whose charm constantly increased. Would it be any marvel if she should pine with longing in this solitude, and even suffer physically from their severe privations? The perception that love now supplied the place of all which she had lost pleased him, but he forbade himself to expect that this condition of affairs could be lasting. Nothing save exaggerated self-conceit would induce the hope, but he must have undervalued his own power of attraction or Barine's love, for with each passing week the cheerful serenity of her disposition gained fresh steadfastness and charm. He, too, had the same experience. It was long since he had felt so vigorous, untrammelled, and free from care. His sole regret was the impossibility of sharing the political life of the city at this critical period. And at times he felt some little anxiety concerning the fate and management of his property, though even if his estates were confiscated, he would still retain a competence which he had left in the hands of a trustworthy money-changer. Barine shared everything that concerned him, even these moods, and this led him to tell her about the affairs of the city and the state, in which she had formerly taken little interest, his property in Alexandria and the provinces. With what glad appreciation she listened when she went out with him from the northern anchorage on the open sea, or sat during long winter evenings making nets, an art which she had learned from Dione. Her lute had been sent to her from the city, and what pleasure her singing afforded her husband and herself! How joyously their hosts, old and young, listened to the melody! A few book rolls had also come, and Dion enjoyed discussing their contents with Barine. He himself read very little, for he was rarely indoors during the day. The fourth week after his arrival he was able to aid, with arms whose muscles had been steeled in the Palestra, the men in their fishing and Dionyscos in his boat building. The close, constant, uninterrupted companionship of the married pair revealed to each unexpected treasures in the other, which, perhaps, might have remained forever concealed in city life. Here each was everything to the other, and this undisturbed mutual life soon inspired that blissful consciousness of inseparable union which usually appears only after years as the fairest fruit of a marriage founded on love. Doubtless there were hours when Barine longed to see her mother and others who were dear to her, but the letters which arrived from time to time prevented this yearning from becoming a source of actual pain. Prudence required them to restrict their intercourse with the city, but whenever Pyrrhus went to market, letters reached the island, delivered at the fish auction in the harbour by Anukis, Charmian's Nubian maid, to the old freedman who had become her close friend. So the time came when Dion could say without self-deception that Barine was content in this solitude, and that his love and companionship supplied the place of the exciting, changeful life of the capital. Though letters came from her mother, sister, or Charmian, her grandfather, Gorgias, or Archibius, not one transformed the wish to leave her desolate hiding place into actual homesickness, but each brought fresh subjects for conversation, and among them many which, by arousing the interest of both, united them more firmly. The second month of their flight a letter arrived from Archibius, in which he informed them that they might soon form plans for their return, for Alexas the Syrian had proved a malicious traitor. He had not performed the commission entrusted to him of winning Herod to Antony's cause, but treacherously deserted his patron and remained with the King of the Jews. When, with unprecedented shamelessness, he sought Octavianus to sell the secrets of his Egyptian benefactor, he was arrested and executed in his own home, Laodicea. Now, their friend continued, Cleopatra's eyes, as well as her husband's, were opened to the true character of Barine's most virulent accuser. The influence of Philostratus, too, was, of course, destroyed by his brother's infamous deed. Yet they must wait a little longer, for Cæsarion had joined the Ephebi, and Antyllus had been invested with the toga virilis. They could now undertake many things independently, and Cæsarion often made remarks which showed that he would not cease to lay plots for Barine. Dion feared nothing from the royal boy on his own account, but for his wife's sake he dared not disregard his friend's warning. This was hard, for, though he still felt happy on the island, he longed to install the woman he loved in his own house, and every impulse of his nature urged him to be present at the meetings of the council in these fateful times. Therefore he was more than ready to risk returning to the city, but Barine entreated him so earnestly not to exchange the secure happiness they enjoyed here for a greater one, behind which might lurk the heaviest misfortune, that he yielded. Another letter from Charmian soon proved the absolute necessity of continuing to exercise caution. Even from the island they could perceive that everything known as festal pleasure was rife in Alexandria, and bore along in its mad revelry the court and the citizens. When the wind blew from the south, it brought single notes of inspiring music or indistinct sounds of the wildest popular rejoicing. The fisherman's daughter, Dione, often called them to the strand to admire the galleys adorned with fabulous splendour, garlanded with flowers, and echoing with the music of lutes and the melody of songs. Sails of purple embroidered silk bore the vessels over the smooth tide. Once the watchers even distinguished, upon a barge richly adorned with gilded carving, young female slaves who, with floating hair and transparent sea-green robes, handled, in the guise of Nereids, light sandalwood oars with golden blades. Often the breeze bore to the island the perfumes which surrounded the galleys, and on calm nights the magnificent ships, surrounded by the magical illumination of many-hued lamps, swept across the mirror-like surface of the waves. Among the voyagers were gods, goddesses, and heroes who, standing or reclining in beautiful groups, represented scenes from the myths and history. On the deck of the Queen's superb vessel, guests, crowned with wreaths, lay on purple couches under garlands of flowers, eating choice viands and draining golden wine cups. On other nights the illumination of the shore of the Bruchium rendered it as bright as day. The huge dome of the Serapeum on the Rhacotis, covered with lamps, towered above the flat roofs of the city like the starry firmament of a smaller world which had descended to earth. Every temple and palace was transformed into a giant candelabrum, and the rows of lamps on the quay stretched like tendrils of light from the dazzlingly illuminated marble temple of Poseidon to the palace at Lochias, steeped in radiance. When Pyrrhus or one of his sons returned from market, they described the festivals and shows, banquets, races, and endless pleasure excursions arranged by the court, which made the citizens fairly hold their breath. It was a prosperous time for the fishermen. The Queen's cooks took all their wares and paid a liberal price. January had come when another letter arrived from Charmian. Dion and Barine had watched in vain for any unusual events on Cleopatra's birthday, but on Antony's, a few days later, there was plenty of music and shouting, and in the evening an unusually magnificent illumination. 2 days after, this letter was delivered to Pyrrhus by his dusky friend Anukis. Her inquiry whether he thought it prudent to convey visitors to his guests was answered in the negative, for since Octavianus had been in Asia, the harbour swarmed with the boats of spies, and a single act of imprudence might bring ruin. Charmian's letter, too, was even better calculated to curb Dion's increasing desire to return home than the fisherman's warning. True, the beginning contained good news of Barine's relatives, and then informed Dion that his uncle, the keeper of the seal, was fairly revelling in bliss. His inventive gifts were taxed more than ever. Every day brought a festival, every night magnificent banquets. One spectacle, excursion, or hunting party followed another. In the theatres, the Odeum, the hippodrome, no more brilliant performances, races, naval battles, gladiatorial struggles, and combats between beasts had been given, even before Actium. Dion himself had formerly attended the entertainments of those who belonged to the court circle, the society of inimitable livers. It had been revived again, but Antony called them the comrades of death. This was significant. Every one knows that the end is drawing near, and imitates the Pharaoh to whom the oracle promised 6 years of life, and who convicted it of falsehood and made them 12, by carousing during the night also. The Queen's meeting with her husband, which she had previously reported, had been magnificent. At that time, she wrote, we hoped that a more noble life would begin, and Mark Antony, awakened and elevated by his rekindled love, would regain his former heroic power. But we were mistaken. Cleopatra, it is true, toiled unceasingly, but her lover, with his enormous bunch of roses, gave the signal for the maddest revelry which the imagination of the wildest devotee of pleasure could conceive. The performances of the inimitable livers were far surpassed by those of the comrades of death. Antony is at their head, and he, whose giant frame resists even the most unprecedented demands, succeeds in stupefying himself and forgetting the impending ruin. When he comes to us after a night of revelry, his eyes sparkle as brightly, his deep voice has as clear a ring as at the beginning of the banquet. The Queen is his goddess, and who could remain unmoved when the giant bows obediently to the nod of his delicate sovereign, and devises and offers the most unprecedented things to win a smile from her lips? The changeful, impetuous wooing of youth lies far behind him, but his homage, which the Ephebi of to-day would perhaps term antiquated, has always seemed to me as if a mountain were bending before a star. The stranger who sees her in his company believes her a happy woman. Amid the fabulous radiance of the festal array, when all who surround her admire, worship, and strew flowers in her path, one might believe that the old sunny days had returned. But when we are alone, how rarely I see her smile! Then she plans for the tomb, which, under Gorgias's direction, is rapidly rising, and considers with him the best method of rendering it an inaccessible place of retreat. She decided everything down to the carving on the stone sarcophagi. In addition, there are to be rooms and chambers in the lower story for the reception of her treasures. Beneath them she has had corridors made for the pitch and straw, which, if the worst should come, are to be lighted. She will then give to the flames the gold and silver, gems and jewels, ebony and ivory, the costly spices, in short, all her valuables. The pearls alone are worth many kingdoms. Who can blame her if she prefers to destroy them rather than leave them for the foe? The garden in which you grew up, Barine, is now the scene of the happy, busy life led by Alexander and the twins. There, under my brother's guidance, they frolic, build, and dig. Cleopatra goes to it whenever she longs for repose after the pursuit of pleasures which have lost their zest. When, the day before yesterday, Antony, crowned with ivy as the new Dionysus, drove up the street of the king in the golden chariot drawn by tamed lions to bring her the new Isis from the Lochias in a lotus flower made of silver and white paste, drawn by 4 snow-white steeds. She pointed to the glittering train and said, "Between the quiet of the philosopher's garden, where I began my life and still feel most at ease, and the grave, where nothing disturbs my last repose, stretches the street of the king, with this deafening tumult, this empty splendor. It is mine." "Oh, child, it was very different in former days. She loved Mark Antony with passionate ardor. He was the first man in the world, and yet he bowed before the supremacy of her will. The longing of the awakening heart, the burning ambition which already kindled the soul of the child, had alike found satisfaction, and the world beheld how the mortal woman, Cleopatra, for her lover and herself, could steep this meagre life with the joys of the immortals. He was grateful for them, and the most generous of men laid at the feet of the great Queen of the East the might of Rome and the kings of 2 quarters of the globe. These years were spent by both in one long revel. His marriage with Octavia brought the first awakening. It was hard and painful. He had not deserted Cleopatra for a woman's sake, but on account of his endangered power and sovereignty. But the unloved Octavia constrained him to look up to her with respectful admiration. Nay, she became dear to him. A fierce battle for him in his heart arose between the two. It was fought with very different weapons, and Cleopatra conquered. The revel, the dream, began again. Then came Actium, the disenchantment, the awakening, the fall, the flight from the world. Our object was not to let him relapse into intoxication, to rouse the hero's strength and courage from their slumber, render him for love's sake a fellow combatant in the common cause. But he had become accustomed to see in her the giver of ecstasy. The only thing that he still desired was to drain the cup of pleasure in her society till all was over. She sees this, grieves over it, and leaves no means of rousing him to fresh energy untried. Yet how rarely he rallies his powers to earnest labour! While she is fortifying the mouths of the Nile and the frontiers of the country, building ship after ship, arming and negotiating, she cannot resist him when he summons her to new pleasures. Though so many of the traits which rendered him great and noble have vanished, she cannot give up the old love and clings steadfastly to him because I know not why. A woman's loving heart does not question motives and laws. Besides, he is the father of her children, and in playing with them he regains the old joyousness of mood so enthralling to the heart. Since Archibius has taken charge of them, they can dispense with Euphronion, their tutor. The clever man knows Rome, Octavianus, and those who surround him, so he was chosen as an envoy. His object was to induce the conqueror to transfer the sovereignty of Egypt to the boys Antonius Helios and Alexander, but Cæsar vouchsafed no answer to the mediator in Antony's affairs, nay, did not even grant him an audience. To Cleopatra, Octavianus promised friendly treatment and the fulfilment of her wish concerning the boys if, and now came the repetition of the old demand, she would put Antony out of the world or deliver him into his hands. This demand, which contains base treachery, was impossible for her noble soul. Since she had resolved to build the tomb, granting it became impossible. Yet Octavianus made every effort to tempt her to the base deed. True, the death of this one man would have spared much bloodshed. The Cæsar knows how to choose his tools. He sent here as negotiator a clever young man who possessed great charms of mind and person. No plan to prejudice the Queen against her husband and persuade her to commit the treachery was left untried. He went so far as to assure Cleopatra that in former years she had won the Cæsar's heart, and that he still loved her. She accepted these assurances at their true value and remained steadfast. Antony at first paid no heed to the intriguer, but when he learned what means he employed, and especially how he made use of the surrender of one of Cæsar's murderers, which he himself had long regretted, to brand him as an ungrateful traitor, he would not have been Mark Antony if he had accepted it quietly. He was completely his old self when he ordered the smooth fellow, who, however, had come as the ambassador of the mighty victor, to be scourged, sent him back to Rome, and wrote a letter to Octavianus in which he complained of the man's arrogance and presumption, adding, "Spite of my heavy heart, I cannot help smiling when I think of it. That misfortune had rendered him unusually irritable. Yet if his action perhaps displeased Cæsar, he might treat his freedman Hipparchus, who was in his power, as he had served Thyrsis." You see that his gay arrogance has not deserted him. Trouble slips away from him as rain is shaken from the coarse military cloak which he wore in the Parthian War, and therefore it cannot exert its purifying power. When we consider that a few years ago this man, as it were, doubled himself when peril was most threatening, his conduct now, on the eve of the decisive struggle, is intelligible only to those who know him as we do. If he fights, he will no longer do so to save himself, or even to conquer, but to die an honourable death. If he still enjoys the pleasures offered, he believes that he can thus mitigate for himself the burden of defeat and diminish the grandeur of the conqueror's victory. In the eyes of the world, at least, a man who can still revel like Antony is only half vanquished. Yet the lofty tone of his mind was lowered. The surrender of the murderer of Cæsar, his name was Turullius, proves it. And this, Barine, tell your husband so. This is what fills me with anxiety and compels me to entreat you not to think of returning home yet. Antony is now the jovial companion of his son, and permits Antyllus to share all his own pleasures. Of course he heard of Cæsarion's passion, and is disposed to help the poor fellow. He has often said that nothing would be better served to rouse the dreamer from torpor than your charming vivacity. As the earth could scarcely have swallowed you up, you would be found. He, too, should be glad to hear you sing again. I know that search will be made for you. How imperiously this state of affairs requires you to exercise caution needs no explanation. On the other hand, you may find comfort in the tidings that Cleopatra intends to send Cæsarion with his tutor Rhodon to Ethiopia by way of the island of Philae. Archibius heard through Timagenes that Octavianus considers the son of Cæsar, whose face so wonderfully resembles his father's, a dangerous person, and this opinion is the boy's death warrant. Antyllus, too, is going on a journey. His destination is Asia, where he is to seek to propitiate Octavianus and make him new offers. As you know, he was betrothed to his daughter Julia. The Queen ceased long ago to believe in the possibility of victory, yet, spite of all the demands of the comrades of death and her own care, she toils unweariedly in preparing for the defence of the country. She is doubtless the only member of that society who thinks seriously of the approaching end. Now that the tomb is rising, she ponders constantly upon death. She who was taught by Epicurus to strive for freedom from pain, and is so sensitive to the slightest bodily suffering, is still seeking a path which, with the least agony, will lead to the eternal rest for which she longs. Iris and the younger pupils of Olympus are aiding her. The old man furnishes all sorts of poisons, which she tries upon various animals, nay, recently even on criminals sentenced to death. All these experiments seem to prove that the bite of the uraeus serpent, whose image on the Egyptian crown symbolizes the sovereign's instant power over life and death, stills the heart most swiftly and with the least suffering. How terrible these things are! What pain it causes to see the being one loves most, the mother of the fairest children, so cruelly heighten the anguish of parting, choose death, as it were, for a constant companion, amid the whirl of the gayest amusements. She daily looks all his terrors in the face, yet with proud contempt turns her back upon the bridge which might perhaps enable her for a time to escape the monster. This is grand, worthy of her, and never have I loved her more tenderly. You, too, must think of her kindly. She deserves it. A noble heart, which sees itself forced to pity a foe, easily forgives. And was she ever your enemy? I have written a long, long letter to solace your seclusion from the world and relieve my own heart. Have patience a little while longer. The time is not far distant when fate itself will release you from exile. How often your relatives, Archibius and Gorgias, whom I now see frequently in the presence of the Queen, long to visit you, but they too believe that it might prove a source of danger. The warnings in this letter were confirmed by another from Archibius, and soon after they heard that Cæsarion had really sailed up the Nile for Ethiopia with his tutor Rhodon, and Antyllus had been sent to Asia to visit Octavianus. The latter had received him, it is true, but sent him home without making any pledges. These tidings were not brought by letter, but by Gorgias himself, whose visit surprised them one evening late in March. Rarely had a guest received a more joyous welcome. When he entered the bare room, Barine was making a net and telling the fisherman's daughter, Dione, the story of the wanderings of Ulysses. Dion, too, listened attentively, now and then correcting or explaining her descriptions, while carving a head of Poseidon for the prow of a newly built boat. As Gorgias unexpectedly crossed the threshold, the dim light of the lamp, fed by Kiki oil, seemed transformed into sunshine. How brightly their eyes sparkled! How joyous were their exclamations of welcome and surprise! Then came questions, answers, news. Gorgias was obliged to share the family supper, which had only waited the return of the father who had brought the guest. The fresh oysters, langustae, and other dishes served tasted more delicious to the denizen of the city than the most delicious banquets of the comrades of death, to which he was now frequently invited by the Queen. All that Pyrrhus said voluntarily, and told his sons in reply to their questions, was so sensible and related to matters which, because they were new to Gorgias, seemed so fascinating, that when Dion's good wine was served, he declared that if Pyrrhus would receive him, he too would search for pursuers and be banished here. When the three again sat alone before the plain clay mixing vessel, it seemed to the lonely couple as if the best part of the city life which they had left behind had found its way to them. And what did they not have to say to one another? Dion and Barine talked of their hermit life, Gorgias of the Queen and the tomb, which was at the same time a treasure chamber. The slanting walls were built as firmly as if they were intended to last for centuries and defy a violent assault. The centre of the lower story was formed by a lofty hall of vast dimensions, in whose midst were the large marble sarcophagi. Men were working busily upon the figures in relief, intended for the decoration of the sides and lids. This hall, whose low arched ceiling was supported by 3 pairs of heavy columns, was furnished like a reception room. The couches, candelabra, and altars were already being made. Charmian had kept the fugitives well informed. In the subterranean chambers at the side of the hall and in the second story, which could not be commenced until the ceiling was completed, storerooms were to be made, and below and beside them were passages for ventilation and the storage of combustible materials. Gorgias regretted that he could not show his friend the hall, which was perhaps the handsomest and most costly he had ever created. The noblest material, brown porphyry, emerald green serpentine, and the dark varieties of marble had been used, and the mosaic and brass doors, which were nearing completion, were masterpieces of Alexandrian art. To have all this destroyed was a terrible thought, but even more unbearable was that of its object, to receive the body of the Queen. Again rapturous admiration of this greatest and noblest of women led Gorgias to enthusiastic rhapsodies, until Dion exercised his office of soberer, and Barine asked tidings of her mother, her grandparents, and her sister. There was nothing but good news to be told. True, the architect had to wage a daily battle with the old philosopher, who termed it an abuse of hospitality to remain so long at his friends with his whole family, but thus far Gorgias had won the victory even against Berenike, who wished to take her father and his household to her own home. Cleopatra had purchased the house and garden of Didymus at thrice their value, the architect added. He was now a wealthy man and had commissioned him to build a new mansion. The land facing the sea and near the museum had been found, but the handsome residence would not be completed until summer. The dry Egyptian air would have permitted him to roof it sooner, but there were many of Helena's wishes, most of them very sensible ones, to be executed. Barine and Dion glanced significantly at each other, but the architect, perceiving it, exclaimed, "Your mute language is intelligible enough, and I confess that for 5 months Helena has seemed to me the most attractive of maidens. I see, too, that she has some regard for me, but as soon as I stand before her, the Queen I mean, and hear her voice, it seems as if a tempest swept away every thought of Helena. And it is not in my nature to deceive any one. How can I woo a girl whom I so deeply honour, your sister Barine, when the image of another rules my soul?" Dion reminded him of his own words that the Queen was loved only as a goddess, and without waiting for his reply, turned the conversation to other topics. It was 3 hours after midnight when Pyrrhus warned Gorgias that it was time for departure. When the fisherman's fleetest boat was at last bearing him back to the city, he wondered whether girls who, before marriage, lived like Helena in undisturbed seclusion, would really be better wives and more content with every lot than the much-courted Barine, whom Dion had led from the gayest whirl of life in the capital to the most desolate solitude. This delightful evening was followed by a day of excitement and grave anxiety. It had been necessary to conceal the young couple from the collector's officials, who took from Pyrrhus part of his last year's savings and the large new boat which he used to go out on the open sea. The preparations for war required large sums. All vessels suitable for the purpose were seized for the fleet, and all residents of the city and country shared the same fate as Pyrrhus. Even the temple treasures were confiscated, and yet no one could help saying to himself that the vast sums which, through these pitiless extortions, flowed into the treasury were used for the pleasures of the court as well as for the equipment of the fleet and the army. Yet so great was the people's love for the Queen, so high their regard for the independence of Egypt, so bitter their hate of Rome, that there was no rebellion. How earnestly Cleopatra, amid all the extravagant revels from which she could not too frequently absent herself, toiled to advance the military preparations, could be seen even by the exiles from their cliff, for work in 2 dockyards was continued day and night, and the harbor was filled with vessels. Ships of war were continually moving to and fro, and from the Serpent Island they witnessed constantly, often by starlight, the drilling of the oarsmen and of whole squadrons upon the open sea. Sometimes a magnificent state galley appeared, on whose deck was Antony, who inspected the hastily equipped fleet to make the newly recruited sailors one of those kindling speeches in which he was a master hard to surpass. 2 sons of Pyrrhus were now numbered in the crews of the recently built warships. They had been impressed into the service in April, and though Dion had placed a large sum at their father's disposal to secure their release, the attempt was unsuccessful. So there had been sorrow and tears in the contented little colony of human beings on the lonely cliff, and when Dionysus and Dionyscus had a day's leave of absence to visit their relatives, they complained of the cruel haste with which the young men were drilled and wearied to exhaustion, and spoke of the sons of citizens and peasants who had been dragged from their villages, their parents, and their business, to be trained for seamen. There was great indignation among them, and they listened only too readily to the agitators, who whispered how much better they would have fared on the galleys of Octavianus. Pyrrhus entreated his sons not to join any attempt at mutiny. The women, on the contrary, would have approved anything which promised to release the youths from their severe service, and their bright cheerfulness was transformed into anxious depression. Barine, too, was no longer the same. She had lost her joyous activity. Her eyes were often wet with tears, and she moved with drooping head as if some heavy care oppressed her. Was it the heat of April? Was it desert winds which had brought the transformation? Had longing for the changeful, exciting life of former days at last overpower her? Was solitude becoming unendurable? Was her husband's love no longer sufficient to replace the many pleasures she had sacrificed? No, it could not be that. Never had she gazed with more devoted tenderness into Dion's face than when entirely alone with him in shady nooks. She who in such hours looked the very embodiment of happiness and contentment certainly was neither ill nor sorrowful. Dion, on the contrary, held his head high early and late, and appeared as proud and self-conscious as though life was showing him its fairest face. Yet he had heard that his estates had been sequestrated, and that he owed it solely to the influence of Archibius and his uncle that his property, like that of so many others, had not been added to the royal treasures. But what disaster could he not have speedily vanquished in these days? A great joy, the greatest which the immortals can bestow upon human beings, was dawning for him and his young wife, and in May the women on the island shared her blissful hope. Pyrrhus brought from the city an altar and a marble statue of Eleutheria, the goddess of birth, called by the Romans Lucina, which his friend Anukis had given him in Charmian's name for the young wife. She had again spoken of the serpents which lived in such numbers in the neighbouring islands, and her question whether it would be difficult to capture one alive was answered by the freedman in the negative. The image of the goddess and the altar were erected beside the other sanctuaries, and how often the stone was anointed by Barine and the women of the fisherman's family. Dion vowed to the goddess a beautiful temple on the cliff and in the city if she would be gracious to his beloved young wife. When in June the noonday sun blazed most fiercely, the fishermen brought to the cliff Helena, Barine's sister, and Chloris, Dion's nurse, who had been a faithful assistant of his mother, and afterwards managed the female slaves of the household. How joyously and gratefully Barine held out her arms to her sister! Her mother had been prevented from coming only by the warning that her disappearance would surely attract the attention of the spies, and the latter were very alert, for Mark Antony had not yet given up the pursuit of the singer, nor had the attorney Philostratus recalled the proclamation offering 2 talents for the capture of Dion, and both the latter's palace and Berenike's house were constantly watched. It seemed more difficult for the quiet Helena to accommodate herself to this solitude than for her gayer natured sister. Plainly, as she showed her love for Barine, she often lapsed into reverie, and every evening she went to the southern side of the cliff and gazed towards the city, where her grandparents doubtless sorely missed her, spite of the careful attention bestowed upon them in Gorgias's house. 8 days had passed since her arrival, and life in this wilderness seemed more distasteful than on the first and the second. The longing for her grandparents, too, appeared to increase, for that day she had gone to the shore, even under the burning rays of the noonday sun, to gaze towards the city. How dearly she loved the old people! But Dion's conjecture that the tears sparkling in Helena's eyes when she entered their room at dusk were connected with another resident of the capital, spite of his wife's indignant denial, appeared to be correct. For a short time after, clear voices were heard in front of the house, and when a deep, hearty laugh rang out, Dion started up, exclaiming, "Gorgias never laughs in that way, except when he has had some unusual piece of good fortune." He hurried out as he spoke and gazed around, but notwithstanding the bright moonlight he could see nothing except Father Pyrrhus on his way back to the anchorage. But Dion's ears were keen, and he fancied he heard subdued voices on the other side of the dwelling. He followed the sound without delay, and when he turned the corner of the building, stopped short in astonishment, exclaiming as a low cry rose close before him, "Good evening, Gorgias. I'll see you later. I won't interrupt you." A few rapid steps took him back to Barine, and as he whispered, "I saw Helena out in the moonlight, soothing her longing for her grandparents in Gorgias's arms," she clapped her hands and said, smiling, "That's the way one loses good manners in this solitude, to disturb the first meeting of a pair of lovers. But Gorgias treated us in the same way in Alexandria, so he is now paid in his own coin." The architect soon entered the room, with Helena leaning on his arm. Hour by hour he had missed her more and more painfully, and on the 8th day found it impossible to endure life's burden longer without her. He now protested that he could approach her mother and grandparents as a suitor with a clear conscience. For on the 3rd day after Helena's departure the relation between him and the Queen had changed. In Cleopatra's presence the image of the granddaughter of Didymus became even more vivid than that of the peerless sovereign had formerly been in Helena's. Outside of the pages of poetry he had never experienced longing like that which had tortured him during the past few days. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21. This time the architect could spend only a few hours on the Serpent Island, for affairs in the city were beginning to wear a very serious aspect, and the building of the monument was pushed forward even during the night. The interior of the first story was nearly completed, and the rough portion of the second was progressing. The mosaic workers who were making the floor of the great hall had surpassed themselves. It was impossible to wait longer for the sculptures which were to adorn the walls. At present, slabs of polished black marble were to occupy the places intended for bronze reliefs. The utmost haste was necessary. Octavianus had already reached Pelusium. Even if Seleucus, the commander of the garrison, held the strong fortress a long time, a part of the hostile army might appear before Alexandria the following week. A considerable force, however, was ready to meet him. The fleet seemed equal to that of the enemy. The horsemen whom Antony had led before the Queen would delight the eye of any one versed in military affairs, and the Imperator hoped much from the veterans who had served under him in former times, learned to know his generosity and open hand in the hour of prosperity, and probably had scarcely forgotten the eventful days when he had cheerfully and gaily shared their perils and privations. Helena remained on the cliff, and her longing for the old couple had materially diminished. Her hands moved nimbly, and her cheerful glance showed that the lonely life on the island was beginning to unfold its charms to her. The young husband, however, had grown very uneasy. He concealed it before the women, but old Pyrrhus often had much difficulty in preventing his making a trip to the city, which might imperil, on the eve of the final decision, the result of their long endurance and privation. Dion had often wished to set sail with his wife for a great city in Syria or Greece, but fresh and mighty obstacles had deterred him. A special danger lay in the fact that every large vessel was thoroughly searched before it left the harbour, and it was impossible to escape from it without passing through the narrow straits east of the Pharos or the opening in the Heptastadium, both of which were easily guarded. The calm moderation that usually distinguished the young counsellor had been transformed into feverish restlessness, and the heart of his faithful old monitor had also lost its poise, for an encounter between the fleet in which his sons served and that of Octavianus was speedily expected. One day he returned from the city greatly excited. Pelusium was said to have fallen. When he ascended the cliff, he found everything quiet. No one, not even Dione, came to meet him. What had happened here? Had the fugitives been discovered and dragged with his family to the city to be thrown into prison, perhaps sent to the stone quarries? Deadly pale, but erect and composed, he walked towards the house. He owed to Dion and his father the greatest blessing in life, liberty, and the foundation of everything else he possessed. But if his fears were verified, if he was bereft of friends and property, even as a lonely beggar, he might continue to enjoy his freedom. If, for the sake of those to whom he owed his best possession, he must surrender the rest, it was his duty to bear fate patiently. It was still light. Even when he had approached very near the house, he heard no sound save the joyous barking of his wolfhound Argus, which leaped upon him. He now laid his hand upon the lock of the door, but it was flung open from the inside. Dion had seen him coming, and, enraptured by the new happiness with which this day had blessed him, he flung himself impetuously on the breast of his faithful friend, exclaiming, "A boy! A splendid boy! We will call him Pyrrhus!" Bright tears of joy streamed down the freedman's face and fell on his grey beard, and when his wife came towards him with her finger on her lips, he whispered in a tremulous voice, "When I brought them here, you were afraid that the city people would drag us into ruin, but nevertheless you received them as they deserve to be, and he's going to name him Pyrrhus. And now, what has a fellow like me done to have such great and beautiful blessings fall to my lot?" "And I," sobbed his wife, "and the child, the darling little creature." This day of sunny happiness was followed by others of quiet joy, of the purest pleasure, yet mingled with the deepest anxiety. They also brought many an hour in which Helena found an opportunity to show her prudence, while old Chloris and the fisherman's wife aided her by their experience. Every one, down to the greybeard, whose name the little one bore, declared that there had never been a lovelier young mother than Barine, or a handsomer child than the infant Pyrrhus, but Dion could no longer endure to remain on the cliff. A thousand things which he had hitherto deemed insignificant and allowed to pass unheeded now seemed important and imperatively in need of his personal attention. He was a father, and any negligence might be harmful to his son. With his bronze complexion and long hair and beard, he required little aid to disguise him from his friends. In the garments shabby by long use, and with his delicate hands calloused by work in the dockyard, any one would have taken him for a real fisherman. Perhaps it was foolish, but the desire to show himself in the character of a father to Barine's mother and grandparents and to Gorgias seemed worth risking a slight danger. So, without informing Barine, who was now able to walk about her room, he set out for the city after sunset on the last day of July. He knew that Octavianus was encamped in the hippodrome east of Alexandria. The white mounds which had risen there had been recognized as tents even from the Serpent Island. Pyrrhus had returned in the afternoon with tidings that Antony's mounted troops had defeated those of Octavianus. This time the news of victory could be trusted, for the palace at Lochias was illuminated for a festival, and when Dion landed there was a great bustle on the quay. One shouted to another that all would be well. Mark Antony was his old self again. He had fought like a hero. Many who yesterday had cursed him today mingled their voices in the shouts of Viva Voe, which rang out for the new Dionysus, who had again proved his claim to godship. The late visitor found the grandparents alone in the house of Gorgias. They had been informed of Barine's new happiness long before. Now they rejoiced with Dion and wanted to send at once for their host and future son-in-law, who was in the city attending a meeting of the Ephebi, although he had ceased some time ago to be a member of their company. But Dion wished to greet him among the youths who had invited the architect to give them his aid in deciding the question of the course they were to pursue in the impending battle. Yet he did not leave the old couple immediately. He was expecting two visitors, Barine's mother and Charmian's Nubian maid, who, since the birth of little Pyrrhus, had come to the philosophers every evening. The former's errand was to ask whether any news of the mother and child had been received during the day, the latter to get the letters which she delivered the next morning at the fish market to her friend Pyrrhus or his sons. Anukis was the first to appear. She relieved her sympathizing heart by a brief expression of congratulations, but gladly as she would have listened to the most minute details concerning the beloved young mother from the lips of Dion himself, she repressed her own wishes for her mistress's sake, and returned to Charmian as quickly as possible to inform her of the arrival of the unexpected guest. Berenike bore her new dignity of grandmother with grateful joy, yet to-night she came oppressed by a grave anxiety, which was not solely due to her power of imagining gloomy events. Her brother Arius and his sons were concealed in the house of a friend, for they seemed threatened by a serious peril. Hitherto Antony had generously borne the philosopher no ill will on the score of his intimate relations with Octavianus, but now that Octavianus was encamped outside the city, the house of the man who, during the latter's years of education, had been his mentor and counsellor, and later a greatly valued friend, was watched by Mardian's orders by the Scythian guard. He and his family were forbidden to enter the city, and his escape to his friend had been effected under cover of the darkness and with great danger. The anxious woman feared the worst for her brother if Mark Antony should conquer, and yet with her whole heart she wished the Queen to gain the victory. She, who always feared the worst, saw in imagination the fortunes of war change, and there was reason for the belief. The bold general, who had gained so many victories and whom the defeat of Actium had only humbled, was said to have regained his former elasticity. He had dashed forward at the head of his men with the heroic courage of former days, nay, with reckless impetuosity. Rumour reported that, with the huge sword he wielded, he had dealt from his powerful charger blows as terrible as those inflicted 25 years before, when, not far from the same spot, he struck Archelaus on the head. The statement that in his golden armour, with the gold helmet framing his bearded face, he resembled his ancestor Heracles, was confirmed by Charmian, who had been borne quickly hither by a pair of the Queen's swift horses. Cleopatra might need her soon, yet she had left the Lochias to question the father about many things concerning the young mother and her boy, who was already dear to her as the first grandson of the man whose suit, it is true, she had rejected, but to whom she owed the delicious consciousness of having loved and been loved in the springtime of life. Dion found her changed. The trying months, which she had described in her letters to Barine, had completely blanched her grey hair. Her cheeks were sunken, and a deep line between her mouth and nose gave her pleasant face a sorrowful expression. Besides, she seemed to have been weeping, and, in fact, heartrending events had just occurred. She had stolen away from Lochias in the midst of a revel. Antony's victory was being celebrated. He himself presided at the banquet. Again his head and breast were wreathed with a wealth of fresh leaves and superb flowers. At his side reclined Cleopatra, robed in light blue garments adorned with lotus flowers, which, like the little coronet on her head, glittered with sapphires and pearls. Charmian said she had rarely looked more beautiful, but she did not add that the Queen had been obliged to have rouge applied to her pale, bloodless cheeks. It was touching to see Antony, after his return from the battle, still in his suit of mail, clasp her in his arms as joyously as if he had won her back, a prize of victory, and with his vanished heroic power regained her, and their mutual love. Her eyes, too, had been radiant with joy, and in the elation of her heart she had given the horseman who, for a deed of special daring, was presented to her, a helmet and coat of mail of solid gold. Yet even before the revel began she had been forced to acknowledge to herself that the commencement of the end was approaching. For a few hours after she had so generously rewarded the man, he had deserted to the foe. Then Antony had challenged Octavianus to a duel and received the unfeeling reply that he would find many roads to death open. This was the language of the cold-hearted foe, secure of superior power. How sadly, too, she had been disappointed in the hope that the veterans who had served under Antony would desert their new commander at the first summons and flock to his standard, for all her husband's efforts in this direction, spite of the bewitching power of his eloquence, failed, while every hour brought tidings of the treacherous desertion from his army of individual warriors and whole maniples. His foe deemed his cause so weak that he did not even resist Mark Antony's attempts to win the soldiers by promises. From all these signs Cleopatra now saw plainly. In her lover's victory only the last flicker of a dying fire, but so long as it burned he should see her follow its light. Therefore she had entered Festal Hall with the victor of the day. She had witnessed a strange festival. It began with tears and reminded Cleopatra of the saying that she herself resembled a banquet served to celebrate a victory before the battle was won. The cup-bearers had scarcely advanced to the guests with their golden vessels when Antony turned to them, exclaiming, "Pour generously, men. Perhaps to-morrow you will serve another master." Then, unlike his usual self, he grew thoughtful and murmured under his breath, "And I shall probably be lying outside a corpse, a miserable nothing." Loud sobs from the cup-bearers and servants followed these words, but he addressed them calmly, assuring them that he would not take them into a battle from which he expected an honourable death rather than rescue and victory. At this Cleopatra's tears flowed also. If this reckless man of pleasure, this notorious spendthrift and disturber of the public peace, with his insatiate desires, had inspired bitter hostility, few had gained the warm love of so many hearts. One glance at his heroic figure, one memory of the days when even his foes conceded that he was never greater than in the presence of the most imminent peril, never more capable of awakening in others the hope of brighter times than amid the sorest privations. One tone of the orator's deep, resonant voice, which so often came from the heart and therefore gained hearts with such resistless power, the recollection of numberless instances of the bright cheerfulness of his nature and his boundless generosity, sufficiently explained the lamentations which burst forth at that banquet, the tears which flowed, tears of genuine feeling. They were also shed for the beautiful Queen, who, unmindful of the spectators, rested her noble brow with its coronal of pearls upon his mighty shoulder. But the grief did not last long, for Mark Antony shouted, "Hence with melancholy! We do not need the larva. We know without its aid that pleasure will soon be over. Xuthus, a joyous festal song, and you, Metrodor, lead the dancers. The first beaker to the fairest, the best, the wisest, the most cherished, the most fervently beloved of women." As he spoke, he waved his goblet aloft. The flute player Xuthus beckoned to the chorus, and the dancer Metrodor, in the guise of a butterfly, led forth a bevy of beautiful girls who, in the cloud of ample robes, of transparent coloured bombyx which floated around them, executed the most graceful figures, and now hovered like mists, now flitted to and fro as if borne on wings, affording the most charming variety to the delighted spectators. The comrades of death had again become companions in pleasure, and when Charmian, who did not lose sight of her mistress, noticed the sorrowful quiver of her lips and glided out of the circle of guests, the faithful Nubian had approached to inform her of Dion's arrival. Then, but this she concealed from her friends, she hastened to her own apartments to prepare to go out. And when Iras opened the door to enter her room, she went to speak to her about the night attendance upon the Queen. But her niece had not perceived her. Shaken by convulsive sobs, she had pressed her face among the cushions of a couch, and there suffered the fierce anguish which had stirred the inmost depths of her being to rave itself out with the full vehemence of her passionate nature. Charmian called her name and, weeping herself, ripened her arms to her, and for the first time since her return from Actium, her sister's daughter again sank upon her breast, and they held each other in a close embrace until Charmian's exclamation, "With her, for her unto death," was answered by Iras's, "To the tomb." This was a word which in many an hour of the silent night had stirred the soul of the woman who had been the youthful playmate of the Queen, who, with bleeding heart, sat below among the revellers at the noisy banquet and forced her to ask the question, "Is not your fate bound to hers? What can life offer you without her?" Now this word was spoken by other lips, and like an echo of Iras's exclamation came the answer, "Unto death, like you, if she precedes us to the other world. Whatever may follow, dying nowhere shall she lack Charmian's hand and heart." "Nor the love and service of Iras," was the answering assurance. So they had parted, and the agitation of this fateful moment was still visible in the features of the woman who had formerly sacrificed to her royal playfellow her love, and now offered her life. When, ere leaving Gorgias's house, she bade her friend farewell, she pressed Dion's hand with affectionate warmth, and, as he accompanied her to the carriage, she informed him that before the first encounter of the troops Archibius had taken the royal children to his estate of Irenia, where they were at present. "Rarely has it been my fate to experience a more sorrowful hour than when I beheld the Queen. Her heart, torn with anguish, bid them farewell. What fate is impending over the dear ones who are so worthy of the greatest happiness? To see the twins and little Alexander recognized and saved from death and insult, and your boy in Barine's arms, is the last wish which I still cherish." On returning to Lochias, Charmian had a long time to wait ere the Queen retired. She dreaded the mood in which she would leave the banquet. For months past Cleopatra had returned from the revels of the comrades of death, saddened to tears or in a blaze of indignation. How must this last banquet, which began so mournfully and continued with such reckless mirth, affect her? At last, the second hour after midnight, Cleopatra appeared. Charmian believed that she must be the sport of some delusion, for the Queen's eyes, which, when she had left her, were full of tears, now sparkled with the radiant light of joy, and as her friend took the crown from her head, she exclaimed, "Why did you depart from the banquet so early? Perhaps it was the last, but I remember no festival more brilliant. It was like the springtime of my love. Mark Antony would have touched the heart of a stone statue by that blending of manly daring and humble devotion devotion which no woman can resist. As in former days, hours shriveled into moments. We were again young, once more united. We were together here at Lochias to-night, and yet in distant years in other places. The notes of the singers, the melodies of the musicians, the figures executed by the dancers were lost upon us. We soared back, hand in hand, to a magic world, and the fairy drama in the realms of the blessed, which passed before us in dazzling splendor and blissful joy, was the dream which I loved best when a child, and at the same time the happiest portion of the life of the Queen of Egypt. It began before the gate of the garden of Epicurus, and continued on the river Cydnus. I again beheld myself on the golden barge, garlanded with wreaths of flowers, reclining on the purple couch, with roses strewn around me, and beneath my jewelled sandals. A gentle breeze swelled the silken sails. My female companions raised their clear voices in song to the accompaniment of lutes. The perfumes floating around us were borne by the wind to the shore, conveying the tidings that the bliss believed by mortals to be reserved for the gods alone was drawing near. And even as his heart and his enraptured senses yield to my sway, his mind, as he himself confessed, was under the thrall of mine. We both felt happy, united by ties which nothing, not even misfortune, could sever. He, the ruler of the world, was conquered, and delighted to obey the behests of the victor, because he felt that she before whom he bowed was his own obedient slave. And no magic goblet effected all this. I breathed more freely, as if relieved from the oppressive delusion. The fire had consumed it also, which had burdened my soul until a few hours ago. No magic spell, only the gifts of mind and soul, which the vanquished victor, the woman Cleopatra, owed to the favour of the immortals, had compelled his lofty manhood to yield. From the Cydnus he brought me hither to the blissful days which we were permitted to pass in my city of Alexandria. 1,000 sunny hours, musical echoing surges which long since dashed down the stream of time, he recalled to life. And I did the same, and our memories blended into one. What never to be forgotten moments we experienced when, with reckless mirth, we mingled unrecognized among the joyous throng. What Olympic delight elated our hearts when the plaudits of thousands greeted us! What joys satiated our minds and senses in our own apartments! What pure, unalloyed nectar of the soul was bestowed upon us by our children! Bliss which we shared with and imparted to each other, until neither knew which was the giver and which the receiver. Everything sad and painful seemed to be effaced from the book of memory, and the child's dream, the fairy tale woven by the power of imagination, stood before my soul as a reality, the same reality, I repeat, which I call my past life. And, Charmian, if death comes to-morrow, should I say that he appeared too early, summoned me ere he permitted life to bestow all its best gifts upon me? No, no, and again no. Whoever in the last hour of existence can say that the fairest dreams of childhood were surpassed by a long portion of actual life may consider himself happy, even in the deepest need and on the verge of the grave. The aspiration to be first and highest among the women of her own time, which had already thrilled the young girl's heart, was fulfilled. The ardent longing for love, which even at that period pervaded my whole being, was satisfied when I became a loving wife, mother, and queen, and friendship, through the favour of destiny, also bestowed upon me its greatest blessings by the hands of Archibius, Charmian, and Iras. Now I care not what may happen. This evening taught me that life had fulfilled its pledges, but others, too, must be enabled to remember the most brilliant of queens, who was also the most frequently beloved of women. For this I will provide. The mausoleum which Gorgias is erecting for me will stand like an indestructible wall between the Cleopatra who today still proudly wears the crown and her approaching humiliation and disgrace. Now I will go to sleep. If my awakening brings defeat, sorrow, and death, I have no reason to accuse my fate. It denied me one thing only, the painless peace which the child and the young girl recognized as the chief good. Yet Cleopatra will possess that also, the domain of death, which, as the Egyptians say, loves silence, is opening its doors to me. The most absolute peace begins upon its threshold. Who knows where it ends? The vision of the intellect does not extend far enough to discover the boundary where, at the end of eternity, which in truth is endless, it is replaced by something else. While speaking, the Queen had motioned to her friend to accompany her into her chamber, from which a door led into the children's room. An irresistible impulse constrained her to open it and gaze into the dark, empty apartment. She felt an icy chill run through her veins. Taking a light from the hand of one of the maids who attended her, she went to little Alexander's couch. Like the others, it was empty, deserted. Her head sank on her breast. The courageous calmness with which she had surveyed her whole past life failed, and like the luxuriant riot in the sky of the most brilliant hues ere the glow of sunset suddenly yields to darkness, Cleopatra's soul, after the lofty elation of the last few hours, underwent a sudden transition, and, overwhelmed by deep, sorrowful depression, she threw herself down before the twins' bed, where she lay weeping softly until Charmian, as day began to dawn, urged her to retire to rest. Cleopatra slowly rose, dried her eyes, and said: "My past life seemed to me just now like a magnificent garden. But how many serpents suddenly stretched out their flat heads with glittering eyes and forked tongues! Who tore away the flowers beneath which they lay concealed? I think, Charmian, it was a mysterious power which here in the children's apartment rules so strongly the most trivial as well as the strongest emotions. It was when did I last hear that ominous word? It was conscience. Here in this abode of innocence and purity, whatever resembles a spot stands forth distinctly before the eyes. Here, O Charmian, if the children were but here, if I could only Yet no. It is fortunate, very fortunate, that they have gone. I must be strong, and their sweet grace would rob me of my energy. But the light grows brighter and brighter. Dress me for the day. It would be easier for me to sleep in a falling house than with such a tumult in my heart." While she was being attired in the dark robes she had ordered, loud shouts arose from the royal harbour below, blended with the blasts of the tuba and other signals directing the movements of the fleet and the army, a large body of troops having been marched during the night to the neighbouring hills overlooking the sea. The notes sounded bold and warlike. The well-armed galleys presented a stately appearance. How often Cleopatra had seen unexpected events occur, apparent impossibilities become possible. Had not the victory of Octavianus at Actium been a miracle? What if fate, like a capricious ruler, now changed from frowns to smiles? What if Antony proved himself the hero of yesterday, the general he had been in days of yore? She had refused to see him again before the battle, that she might not divert his thoughts from the great task approaching. But now, as she beheld him, clad in glittering armour, like the god of war himself, ride before the troops on his fiery Barbary charger, greeting them with the gay salutation, whose warmth sprung from the heart and which had so often kindled the warriors to glowing enthusiasm, she was forced to do violence to her own feelings to avoid calling him and saying that her thoughts would follow his course. But she refrained, and when his purple cloak vanished from her sight, her head drooped again. How different in former days were the cheers of the troops when he showed himself to them! This lukewarm response to his gay, glad greeting was no omen of victory. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22. Dion, too, witnessed the departure of the troops. Gorgias, whom he had found among the Ephebi, accompanied him, and, like the Queen, they saw, in the cautious manner with which the army greeted the general, a bad omen for the result of the battle. The architect had presented Dion to the youths as the ghost of a dead man, who, as soon as he was asked whence he came or whither he was going, would be compelled to vanish in the form of a fly. He could venture to do this. He knew the Ephebi. There was no traitor in their ranks. Dion, the former head of the society, had been welcomed like a beloved brother risen from the dead, and he had the gratification, after so long a time, of turning the scale as speaker in a debate. True, he had encountered very little opposition, for the resolve to hold aloof from the battle against the Romans had been urged upon the Ephebi by the Queen herself through Antyllus, who, however, had already left the meeting when Dion joined it. It had seemed to Cleopatra a crime to claim the blood of the noblest sons of the city for a cause which she herself deemed lost. She knew the parents of many, and feared that Octavianus would inflict a terrible punishment upon them if, not being enrolled in the army, they fell into his power with arms in their hands. The stars were already setting when the Ephebi accompanied their friend, singing in chorus the Hymenæus, which they had been unable to chant on his wedding day. The melody of lutes accompanied the voices, and this nocturnal music was the source of the rumour that the god Dionysus, to whom Mark Antony felt specially akin, and in whose form he had so often appeared to the people, had abandoned him amid songs and music. The youths left Dion in front of the temple of Isis. Gorgias alone remained with him. The architect led his friend to the Queen's mausoleum near the sanctuary, where the men were toiling busily by torchlight. A light scaffolding still surrounded it, but the lofty first story, containing the real tomb, was completed, and Dion admired the art with which the exterior of the edifice suggested its purpose. Huge blocks of dark grey granite formed the walls. The broad front, solemn, almost gloomy in aspect, rose sloping slightly above the massive lofty door, surmounted by a moulding bearing the winged disk of the sun. On either side were niches containing statues of Antony and Cleopatra cast in dark bronze, and above the cornice were brazen figures of love and death, fame and silence, ennobling the Egyptian forms with exquisite works of Hellenic art. The massive door, adorned with brass figures in relief, would have resisted a battering ram. On the side of the steps leading to it lay sphinxes of dark green diorite. Everything connected with this building dedicated to death was grave and massive, suggesting by its indestructibility the idea of eternity. The second story was not yet finished. Masons and stone cutters were engaged in covering the strong walls with dark serpentine and black marble. The huge windlass stood ready to raise a masterpiece of Alexandrian art. This was intended for the pediment, and represented Venus Victrix with helmet, shield, and lance, leading a band of winged gods of love, little archers at whose head Eros himself was discharging arrows and victoriously fighting against the three-headed Cerberus, Death, already bleeding from many wounds. There was no time to see the interior of the building, for Pyrrhus expected his guests to join him at the harbour at sunrise, and the eastern sky was already brightening with the approach of dawn. As the friends reached the landing place, the brass dome of the Serapeum, which towered above everything, was glittering with dazzling splendour. The pennons and masts of the fleet, which was about to set sail from the harbour, seemed steeped in a sea of golden light. Tremulous reflections of the brazen and gilded figures on the prows of the vessels were mirrored in the undulating surface of the sea, and the long shadows of the banks of oars united galley after galley on the surface of the water like the meshes of a net. Here the friends parted, and Dion walked down the quay alone to meet the freedman, who must have found it difficult to guide his boat out of this labyrinth of vessels. The inspection of the mausoleum had detained the young father too long, and, though disguised beyond recognition, he reproached himself for having recklessly incurred a danger whose consequences, he felt this to day for the first time, would not injure himself alone. The whole fleet was awaiting the signal for departure. The vessels which did not belong to it had been obliged to moor in front of the Temple of Poseidon, and all were strictly forbidden to leave the anchorage. Pyrrhus's fishing boat was in the midst, and return to the Serpent Island was impossible at present. How vexatious! Barine was ignorant of his trip to the city, and to be compelled to leave her alone while a naval battle was in progress directly before her eyes distressed him as much as it could not fail to alarm her. In fact, the young mother had waited from early dawn with increasing anxiety for her husband. As the sun rose higher and the strokes of the oars propelling 200 galleys, the shrill whistle of the flutes marking the time, the deep voices of the captains shouting orders, and the blasts of the trumpets filling the air were heard far and near around the island, she became so overwhelmed with uneasiness that she insisted upon going to the shore, though hitherto she had not been permitted to take the air except under the awning stretched for the purpose on the shady side of the house. In vain the women urged her not to let her fears gain the mastery and to have patience, but she would have resisted even force in order to look for him who, with her child, now comprised her world. When, leaning on Helena's arm, she reached the shore, no boat was in sight. The sea was covered with ships of war, floating fortresses moving onward like dragons with 1,000 legs, whose feet were the countless rowers arranged in 3 or 5 sets. Each of the larger galleys was surrounded by smaller ones, from most of which darted dazzling flashes of light, for they were crowded with armed men, and from the prows of the strong boarding vessels the sunbeams glittered on the large, shining metal points, whose office was to pierce the wooden sides of the foe. The gilded statues in the prows of the large galleys shone and sparkled in the broad radiance of the day's star, and flashes of light also came from the low hills on the shore. Here Mark Antony's soldiers were stationed, and the sunbeams reflected from the helmets, coats of mail, and lance heads of the infantry, and the armour of the horsemen quivered with dazzling brilliancy in the hot air of the first day of an Egyptian August. Amid this blazing, flashing, and sparkling in the morning air, so steeped in warmth and radiance, the sounds of warlike preparations from the land and fleet constantly grew louder. Barine, exhausted, had just sunk into a chair which Dione, the fisherman's daughter, had placed in the shade of the highest rock on the northwestern shore of the flat island, when a crashing blast of the tuba suddenly echoed from all the galleys in the Egyptian fleet, and the whole array of vessels filed past the Pharos at the opening of the harbour into the open sea. There the narrow ranks of the wooden giants separated and moved onward in broader lines. This was done quietly and in the same faultless order as a few days before, when a similar manoeuvre had been executed under the eyes of Mark Antony. The longing for combat seemed to urge them steadily forward. The hostile fleet, lying motionless, awaited the attack. But the Egyptian assailants had advanced majestically only a few ships' lengths towards the Roman foe, when another signal rent the air. The women whose ears caught the waves of sound said afterwards that it seemed like a cry of agony. It had given the signal for a deed of unequalled treachery. The slaves, criminals, and the basest of the mercenaries on the rowers' benches in the hold had doubtless long listened intently for it, and when it finally came, the men on the upper benches raised their long oars and held them aloft, which stopped the work of those below, and every galley paused, pointing at the next with the wooden oars outstretched like fingers as if seized with horror. The celerity and faultless order with which the raising of the oars was executed, and vessel after vessel brought to a stand, would have been a credit to an honourable captain, but the manoeuvre introduced one of the basest acts ever recorded in history, and the women, who had witnessed many a naumachia and understood its meaning, exclaimed as if with a single voice, "Treachery! They are going over to the enemy!" Mark Antony's fleet, created for him by Cleopatra, surrendered, down to the last galley, to Cæsar's heir, the victor of Actium, and the man to whom the sailors had vowed allegiance, who had drilled them and only yesterday had urged them to offer a gallant resistance, saw from one of the downs on the shore the strong weapons on which he had based the fairest hopes, not shattered, but delivered into the hands of the enemy. The surrender of the fleet to the foe, he knew it, sealed his destruction, and the women on the shore of the Serpent Island, who were so closely connected with those on whom this misfortune fell, suspected the same thing. The hearts of both were stirred, and their eyes grew dim with tears of indignation and sorrow. They were Alexandrians, and did not desire to be ruled by Rome. Cleopatra, daughter of the Macedonian house of the Ptolemies, had the sole right to govern the city of her ancestors, founded by the great Macedonian. The sorrow they had themselves endured through her sank into insignificance beside the tremendous blow of fate which in this hour reached the Queen. The Roman and Egyptian fleet returned to the harbour as one vast squadron under the same commander, and anchored in the roadstead of the city, which was now its precious booty. Barine had seen enough, and returned to the house with drooping head. Her heart was heavy, and her anxiety for the man she loved hourly increased. It seemed as if the very day star shrank from illuminating so infamous a deed with friendly light, for the dazzling, searching sun of the 1st of August veiled its radiant face with a greyish white mist, and the desecrated sea wrinkled its brow, changed its pure azure robe to yellowish grey and blackish green, while the white foam hissed on the crests of the angry waves. As twilight began to approach, the anxiety of the deserted wife became unendurable. Not only Helena's wise words of caution, but the sight of her child failed to exert their usual influence, and Barine had already summoned the son of Pyrrhus to persuade him to take her in his boat to the city, when Dione saw a boat approaching the Serpent Island from the direction of the sea. A short time after, Dion sprang on shore and kissed from his young wife's lips the reproaches with which she greeted him. He had heard of the treachery of the fleet while entering a hired boat with the freedman in the harbour of Eunostus, Pyrrhus having been detained with the other craft before the temple of Poseidon. The experienced pilot had been obliged to steer the boat in a wider curve against the wind through the open sea, and was delayed a long time by a number of the war vessels of the fleet. Danger and separation were now past, and they rejoiced in the happiness of meeting, yet could not feel genuine joy. Their souls were oppressed by anxiety concerning the fate of the Queen and their native city. As night closed in, the dogs barked violently, and they heard loud voices on the shore. Dion, with a presentiment that misfortune was threatening himself and his dear ones, obeyed the summons. No star illumined the darkness. Only the wavering light of a lantern on the strand and another on the nearest island illumined the immediate vicinity, while southward the lights in the city shone as brightly as ever. Pyrrhus and his youngest son were just pushing a boat into the water to release from the sands another which had run aground in a shallow near the neighbouring island. Dion sprang in with them and soon recognized in the hail the voice of the architect Gorgias. The young father shouted a joyous greeting to his friend, but there was no reply. Soon after, Pyrrhus landed his belated guest on the shore. He had escaped, as the fisherman explained, a great danger, for had he gone to the other island, which swarmed with venomous serpents, he might easily have fallen a victim to the bite of one of the reptiles. Gorgias grasped Dion's hand, but in reply to his gay invitation to accompany him to the house at once, he begged him to listen to his story before joining the ladies. Dion was startled. He knew his friend when his deep voice had such a tone of gloomy discouragement and his head drooped so mournfully. Some terrible event had befallen him. His foreboding had been correct. The first tidings pierced his own soul deeply. He was not surprised to learn that the Romans ruled Alexandria, but a small band of the conquerors, who had been ordered to conduct themselves as if they were in a friendly country, had forced their way into the architect's large house to occupy the quarters assigned to them. The deaf grandmother of Helena and Barine, who had but half comprehended what threatened the citizens, terrified by the noisy entrance of the soldiers, had had another attack of apoplexy and closed her eyes in death before Gorgias set out for the island. But it was not only this sad event which must grieve the hearts of the two sisters that had brought the architect in a stranger's boat to the Serpent Island at so late an hour. His soul was so agitated by the horrible incidents of the day that he needed to seek consolation among those from whom he was sure to find sympathy. Nor was it wholly the terrible things fate had compelled him to witness which induced him to venture out upon the sea so recklessly, but still more the desire to bring to the fugitives the happy news that they might return with safety to their native city. Deeply agitated, nay, confused and overpowered by all he had seen and experienced, the architect, usually so clear and, with all his mental vivacity, so circumspect, began his story. A remonstrance from Dion induced him to collect his thoughts and describe events in the order in which they had befallen him. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23. After accompanying Dion to the harbour, the architect had gone to the Forum to converse with the men he met there and learn what they feared and expected in regard to the future fate of the city. All news reached this meeting place first, and he found a large number of Macedonian citizens who, like himself, wished to discuss passing events in these decisive hours. The scene was very animated, for the most contradictory messages were constantly arriving from the fleet and the army. At first they were very favourable, then came the news of the treason, and soon after of the desertion of the cavalry and foot soldiers. A distinguished citizen had seen Mark Antony, accompanied by several friends, dashing down the quay. The goal of their flight was the little palace on the Choma. Grave men, whose opinion met with little opposition, thought that it was the duty of the Imperator, now that fate had decided against him, and nothing remained save a life sullied by disgrace, to put himself to death with his own hand, like Brutus and so many other noble Romans. Tidings soon came that he had attempted to do what the best citizens expected. Gorgias could not endure to remain longer in the Forum, but hastened to the Choma, though it was difficult to force his way to the wall where a breach had been made. He had found the portion of the shore from which the promontory ran densely crowded with people, from whom he learned that Antony was no longer in the palace, and the sea filled with boats. A corpse was just being borne out of the little palace on the Street of the King, and among those who followed, Gorgias recognized one of Antony's slaves. The man's eyes were red with weeping. He readily obeyed the architect's sign, and, sobbing bitterly, told him that the hapless general, after his army had betrayed him, fled hither When he heard in the palace that Cleopatra had preceded him to Hades, he ordered his body slave Eros to put an end to his life also. The worthy man drew back, pierced his own breast with his sword, and sank dying at his master's feet. But Antony, exclaiming that Eros's example had taught him his duty, thrust the short sword into his breast with his own hand. Yet, deep and severe as was the wound, it did not destroy the tremendous vitality of the gigantic Roman. With touching entreaties, he implored the bystanders to kill him, but no one could bring himself to commit the deed. Meanwhile, Cleopatra's name, coupled with the wish to follow her, was constantly on the lips of the Imperator. At last Diomedes, the Queen's private secretary, appeared to bring him by her orders to the mausoleum where she had taken refuge. Antony, as if animated with fresh vigour, assented, and while being carried thither gave orders that Eros should have a worthy burial. Even though dying, it would have been impossible for the most generous of masters to permit any kindness rendered to pass unrequited. The slave again wept aloud as he uttered the words, but Gorgias hastened at once to the tomb. The nearest way, the Street of the King, had become so crowded with people who had been forced back by Roman soldiers between the Theatre of Dionysus and the Corner of the Muses that he had been compelled to reach the building through a side street. The quay was already unrecognizable, and even in the other streets the populace showed a foreign aspect. Instead of peaceful citizens, Roman soldiers in full armour were met everywhere. Instead of Greek, Egyptian, and Syrian faces, fair and dark visages of alien appearance were seen. The city seemed transformed into a camp. Here he met a cohort of fair-haired Germans, yonder another with locks of red whose home he did not know, and again a vexil of Numidian or Pannonian horsemen. At the temple of the Dioscuri he was stopped. A Hispanian maniple had just seized Antony's son, Antyllus, and after a hasty court-martial killed him. His tutor, Theodotus, had betrayed him to the Romans, but the infamous fellow was being led with bound hands after the corpse of the hapless youth, because he was caught in the act of hiding in his girdle a costly jewel which he had taken from his neck. Before his departure for the island, Gorgias heard that the scoundrel had been sentenced to crucifixion. At last he succeeded in forcing a passage to the tomb, which he found surrounded on all sides by Roman lictors and the Scythian guards of the city, who, however, permitted him, as the architect, to pass. The numerous obstacles by which he had been delayed spared him from becoming an eye-witness of the most terrible scenes of the tragedy which had just ended, but he received a minute description from the Queen's private secretary, a well-disposed Macedonian who had accompanied the wounded Antony and with whom Gorgias had become intimately acquainted during the building of the mausoleum. Cleopatra had fled to the tomb as soon as the fortune of war turned in favour of Octavianus. No one was permitted to accompany her except Charmian and Iras, who had helped her close the heavy brazen door of the massive building. The false report of her death, which had induced Antony to put an end to his life, had perhaps arisen from the fact that the Queen was literally in the tomb. When, borne in the arms of his faithful servants, he reached the mausoleum, mortally wounded, the Queen and her attendants vainly endeavoured to open the heavy brazen portal. But Cleopatra ardently longed to see her dying lover. She wished to have him near to render the last services, assure him once more of her devotion, close his eyes, and, if it was so ordered, die with him. So she and her attendants had searched the place, and when Iras spoke of the windlass which stood on the scaffold to raise the heavy brass plate bearing the bas-relief of Love conquering Death, the Queen and her friends hastened up the stairs. The bearer below fastened the wounded man to the rope, and Cleopatra herself stood at the windlass to raise him, aided by her faithful companions. Diomedes averred that he had never beheld a more piteous spectacle than the gigantic man hovering between heaven and earth in the agonies of death, and, while suffering the most terrible torture, extending his arms longingly towards the woman he loved. Though scarcely able to speak, he tenderly called her name, but she made no reply. Like Iris and Charmian, she was exerting her whole strength at the windlass in the most passionate effort to raise him. The rope running over the pulley cut her tender hands. Her beautiful face was terribly distorted, but she did not pause until they had succeeded in lifting the burden of the dying man higher and higher till he reached the floor of the scaffolding. The frantic exertion by which the three women had succeeded in accomplishing an act far beyond their strength, though it was doubled by the power of the most earnest will and ardent longing, would nevertheless have failed in attaining its object had not Diomedes at the last moment come to their assistance. He was a strong man, and by his aid the dying Roman was seized, drawn upon the scaffolding, and carried down the staircase to the tomb in the first story. When the wounded general had been laid on one of the couches with which the great hall was already furnished, the private secretary retired, but remained on the staircase an unnoticed spectator, in order to be at hand in case the Queen again needed his assistance. Flushed from the terrible exertion which she had just made, with tangled, dishevelled locks, gasping and moaning, Cleopatra, as if out of her senses, tore open her robe, beat her breast, and lacerated it with her nails. Then, pressing her own beautiful face on her lover's wound to stanch the flowing blood, she lavished upon him all the endearing names which she had bestowed on their love. His terrible suffering made her forget her own and the sad fate impending. Tears of pity fell like the refreshing drops of a shower upon the still unwithered blossoms of their love, and brought those which, during the preceding night, had revived anew to their last magnificent unfolding. Boundless, limitless as her former passion for this man, was now the grief with which his agonizing death filled her heart. All that Mark Antony had been to her in the heyday of life, all their mutual experiences, all that each had received from the other, had returned to her memory in clear and vivid hues during the banquet which had closed a few hours ago. Now these scenes, condensed into a narrow compass, again passed before her mental vision, but only to reveal more distinctly the depth of misery of this hour. At last anguish forced even the clearest memories into oblivion. She saw nothing save the tortures of her lover. Her brain, still active, revealed solely the gulf at her feet and the tomb which yawned not only for Antony but for herself. Unable to think of the happiness enjoyed in the past or to hope for it in the future, she gave herself up to uncontrolled despair, and no woman of the people could have yielded more absolutely to the consuming grief which rent her heart, or expressed it in wilder, more frantic language than did this great queen, this woman who, as a child, had been so sensitive to the slightest suffering, and whose afterlife had certainly not taught her to bear sorrow with patience. After Charmian, at the dying man's request, had given him some wine, he found strength to speak coherently instead of moaning and sighing. He tenderly urged Cleopatra to secure her own safety, if it could be done without dishonour, and mentioned Proculejus as the man most worthy of her confidence among the friends of Octavianus. Then he entreated her not to mourn for him, but to consider him happy, for he had enjoyed the richest favours of fortune. He owed his brightest hours to her love, but he had also been the first and most powerful man on earth. Now he was dying in the arms of love, honourable as a Roman who succumbed to Romans. In this conviction he died after a short struggle. Cleopatra had watched his last breath, closed his eyes, and then thrown herself tearlessly on her lover's body. At last she fainted and lay unconscious with her head upon his marble breast. The private secretary had witnessed all this, and then returned with tearful eyes to the second story. There he met Gorgias, who had climbed the scaffolding, and told him what he had seen and heard from the stairs. But his story was scarcely ended when a carriage stopped at the corner of the Muses, and an aristocratic Roman alighted. This was the very Proculejus whom the dying Antony had recommended to the woman he loved as worthy of her confidence. In fact, Gorgias continued, he seemed in form and features one of the noblest of his haughty race. He came commissioned by Octavianus, and is said to be warmly devoted to the Cæsar, and a well-disposed man. We have also heard him mentioned as a poet and a brother-in-law of Maecenas, a wealthy aristocrat. He is a generous patron of literature, and also holds art and science in high esteem. Timagenes lauds his culture and noble nature. Perhaps the historian was right, but where the object in question is the state and its advantage, what we here regard as worthy of a free man appears to be considered of little moment at the court of Octavianus. The lord to whom he gives his services entrusted him with a difficult task, and Proculejus doubtless considered it his duty to make every effort to perform it. And yet, if I see aright, a day will come when he will curse this, and the obedience with which he, a free man, aided Cæsar. But listen. Erect and haughty in his splendid suit of armour, he knocked at the door of the tomb. Cleopatra had regained consciousness and asked, she must have known him in Rome, what he desired. He had come, he answered courteously, by the command of Octavianus to negotiate with her, and the Queen expressed her willingness to listen, but refused to admit him into the mausoleum. So they talked with each other through the door. With dignified composure she asked to have the sons whom she had given to Antony, not Caesarion, acknowledged as kings of Egypt. Proculejus instantly promised to convey her wishes to Cæsar, and gave hopes of their fulfilment. While she was speaking of the children and their claims, she did not mention her own future. The Roman questioned her about Mark Antony's death, and then described the destruction of the dead man's army and other matters of trivial importance. Proculejus did not look like a babbler, but I felt a suspicion that he was intentionally trying to hold the attention of the Queen. This proved to be his design. He had been merely waiting for Cornelius Gallus, the commander of the fleet, of whom you have heard. He, too, ranks among the chief men in Rome, and yet he made himself the accomplice of Proculejus. The latter retired as soon as he had presented the newcomer to the hapless woman. I remained at my post, and now heard Gallus assure Cleopatra of his master's sympathy. With the most bombastic exaggeration, he described how bitterly Octavianus mourned in Mark Antony the friend, the brother-in-law, the co-ruler and sharer in so many important enterprises. He had shed burning tears over the tidings of his death. Never had more sincere ones coursed down any man's cheeks. Gallus, too, seemed to me to be intentionally prolonging the conversation. Then, while I was listening intently to understand Cleopatra's brief replies, my foreman, who, when the workmen were driven away by the Romans, had concealed himself between two blocks of granite, came to me and said that Proculejus had just climbed a ladder to the scaffold in the rear of the monument. 2 servants followed, and they had all stolen down into the hall. I hastily started up. I had been lying on the floor with my head outstretched to listen. Cost what it might, the Queen must be warned. Treachery was certainly at work here. But I came too late. O Dion, if I had only been informed a few minutes before, perhaps something still more terrible might have happened, but the Queen would have been spared what now threatens her. What can she expect from the conqueror who, in order to seize her alive, condescends to outwit a noble, defenceless woman who has succumbed to superior power? Death would have released the unhappy Queen from sore trouble and horrible shame, and she had already raised the dagger against her life. Before my eyes she flung aloft her beautiful arm with the flashing steel, which glittered in the light of the candles in the many-branched candelabra beside the sarcophagi. But I will try to remain calm. You shall hear what happened in regular order. My thoughts grow confused as the terrible scene recurs to my memory. To describe it as I saw it, I should need to be a poet, an artist in words, for what passed before me happened on a stage. You know, it was a tomb. The walls were of dark stone. Dark, too, were the pillars and ceiling, all dark and glittering. Most portions were smoothly polished stone, shining like a mirror. Near the sarcophagi and around the candelabra, as far as the vicinity of the door where the rascally trick was played, the light was brilliant as in a festal hall. Every blood stain on the hand, every scratch, every wound which the desperate woman had torn with her own nails on her bosom, which gleamed snow white from her black robes, was distinctly visible. Farther away on the right and left the light was dim, and near the side walls the darkness was as intense as in a real tomb. On the smooth porphyry columns, the glittering black marble and serpentine, here, there, and everywhere flickered the wavering reflection of the candlelight. The draught kept it continually in motion, and it wavered to and fro in the hall like the restless souls of the damned. Wherever the eye turned it met darkness. The end of the hall seemed black, black as the anteroom of Hades, yet through it pierced a brilliant moving bar, sunbeams which streamed from the stairway into the tomb, and amid which danced tiny motes. How the scene impressed the eye, the home of gloomy Hecate and the Queen and her impending fate! A picture flooded with light, standing forth in radiant relief against the darkness of the heavy, majestic forms surrounding it in a wide circle. This tomb, in this light, would be a palace meet for the gloomy rule of the king of the troop of demons conjured up by the power of a magician, if they have a ruler. But where am I wandering? The artist! I hear you exclaim again. The artist! Instead of rushing forward and interposing, he stands studying the light and its effects in the royal tomb. Yes, yes, I had come too late, far too late. On the stairs leading to the lower story of the building I saw it, but I was not to blame for the delay, not in the least. At first I had been unable to see the men, or even a shadow, but I beheld plainly in the brightest glare of the light the body of Mark Antony on the couch, and in the dusk farther towards the right, Iras and Charmian trying to raise a trapdoor. It was the one which closed the passage leading to the combustible materials stored in the cellar. A sign from the Queen had commanded them to fire it. The first steps of the staircase, down which I was hastening, were already behind me. Then Proculejus, with two men, suddenly dashed from the intense darkness on the other side. Scarcely able to control myself, I sprang down the remaining steps, and while Iras's shrill cry, "Poor Cleopatra, they will capture you," still rang in my ears, I saw the betrayed Queen turn from the door through which, resolved on death, she was saying something to Gallus, perceived Proculejus close behind her, thrust her hand into her girdle, and with the speed of lightning, you have already heard so, throw up her arm with the little dagger to bury the sharp blade in her breast. What a picture! In the full radiance of the brilliant light she resembled a statue of triumphant victory or of noble pride in great deeds accomplished. And then only an instant later, what an outrage was inflicted! Like a robber, an assassin, Proculejus rushed upon her, seized her arm, and wrested the weapon from her grasp. His tall figure concealed her from me, but when, struggling to escape from the ruffian's clutch, she again turned her face towards the hall, what a transformation had occurred! Her eyes, you know how large they are, were twice their usual size, and blazed with scorn, fury, and hatred for the traitor. The cheering light had become a consuming fire. So I imagined the vengeance, the curse which calls down ruin upon the head of a foe. And Proculejus, the great lord, the poet, whose noble nature is praised by the authors on the banks of the Tiber, held the defenceless woman, the worthy daughter of a brilliant line of kings, in a firm grasp, as if it required the exertion of all his strength to master this delicate embodiment of charming womanhood. True, the proud blood of the outwitted lioness urged her to resist this profanation, and Proculejus, an enviable honour, made her feel the superior strength of his arm. I am no prophet, but Dion, I repeat, this shameful struggle and the glances which flashed upon him will be remembered to his dying hour. Had they been darted at me, I should have cursed my life. They blanched even the Roman's cheeks. He was lividly pale as he completed what he deemed his duty. His own aristocratic hands were degraded to the menial task of searching the garments of a woman, the queen, for forbidden wares, poisons, or weapons. He was aided by one of Caesar's freedmen, Epaphroditus, who is said to stand so high in the favour of Octavianus. The scoundrel also searched Iras and Charmian, yet all the time both Romans constantly spoke in cajoling terms of Caesar's favour and his desire to grant Cleopatra everything which was due a queen. At last she was taken back to Lochias, but I felt like a madman, for the image of the unfortunate woman pursued me like my shadow. It was no longer a vision of the bewitching sovereign, nay, it resembled the incarnation of despair, tearless anguish, wrath demanding vengeance. I will not describe it, but those eyes, those flashing, threatening eyes, and the tangled hair on which Antony's blood had flowed, terrible, horrible. My heart grew chilled, as if I had seen upon Athena's shield the head of the Medusa with its serpent locks. It had been impossible for me to warn her in time, or even to seize the traitor's arm. I have already said so, and yet her shining image gazed reproachfully at me for my cowardly delay. Her glance still haunts me, robbing me of calmness and peace. Not until I gaze into Helena's pure, calm eyes will that terrible vision of the face, flooded by light in the midst of the tomb, cease to haunt me. His friend laid his hand on his arm, spoke soothingly to him, and reminded him of the blessings which this terrible day, he had said so himself, had brought. Dion was right to give this warning, for Gorgias's bearing and the very tone of his voice changed as he eagerly declared that the frightful events had been followed by more than happy ones for the city, his friend, and Barine. Then, with a sigh of relief, he continued, I pursued my way home like a drunken man. Every attempt to approach the Queen or her attendants was baffled, but I learned from Charmian's clever Nubian that Cleopatra had been permitted, in Caesar's name, to choose the palace she desired to occupy, and had selected the one at Lochias. I did not make much progress towards my house. The crowd in front of the great gymnasium stopped me. Octavianus had gone into the city, and the people, I heard, had greeted him with acclamations and flung themselves on their knees before him. Our stiff-necked Alexandrians in the dust before the victor. It enraged me, but my resentment was diminished. The members of the gymnasium all knew me. They made way, and ere I was aware of it, I had passed through the door. Tall Phrixus had drawn my arm through his. He appears and vanishes at will, is as alert as he is rich, sees and hears everything, and manages to secure the best places. This time he had again succeeded, for when he released me, we were standing opposite to a newly erected tribune. They were waiting for Octavianus, who was still in the hypostyle of Euergetes, receiving the homage of the epitrope, the members of the council, the gymnasiarch, and I know not how many others. Phrixus said that on Caesar's entry he had held out his hand to his former tutor, bade him accompany him, and commanded that his son should be presented. The philosopher had been distinguished above everyone else, and this will benefit you and yours, for he is Berenike's brother, and therefore your wife's uncle. What he desires is sure to be granted. You will hear at once how studiously the Caesar distinguishes him. I do not grudge it to the man. He interceded boldly for Barine, He is lauded as an able scholar, and he does not lack courage. In spite of Actium and the only disgraceful deed with which, to my knowledge, Mark Antony could be reproached, I mean the surrender of Turullius, Arius remained here, though the Imperator might have held the friend of Julius Caesar's nephew as a hostage as easily as he gave up the Emperor's assassin. Since Octavianus encamped before the city, your uncle has been in serious danger, and his sons shared his peril. Surely you must know the handsome, vigorous young Ephebi. We were not obliged to wait long in the gymnasium ere the Caesar appeared on the platform. And now, if your hand clenches, it is only what I expect. Now all fell on their knees. Our turbulent, rebellious rabble raised their hands like pleading beggars, and grave, dignified men followed their example. Whoever saw me and Phryxus will remember us among the kneeling lickspittles, for had we remained standing, we should certainly have been dragged down. So we followed the example of the others. And Octavianus? Asked Dion eagerly. A man of regal bearing and youthful aspect, beardless, face of the finest chiselling, a profile as beautiful as if created for the coin maker. All the lines sharp and yet pleasing, every inch an aristocrat, but the very mirror of a cold nature, incapable of any lofty aspiration, any warm emotion, any tenderness of feeling. All in all, a handsome, haughty, calculating man, whose friendship would hardly benefit the heart, but from whose enmity may the immortals guard all we love. Again he led Arius by the hand. The philosopher's sons followed the pair. When he stood on the stage, looking down upon the thousands kneeling before him, not a muscle of his noble face, it is certainly that, betrayed the slightest emotion. He gazed at us like a farmer surveying his flocks, and after a long silence said curtly in excellent Greek that he absolved the Alexandrians from all guilt towards him. First, he counted as if he were summoning individual veterans to reward them, from respect for the illustrious founder of our city, Alexander, the conqueror of the world. Secondly, because the greatness and beauty of Alexandria filled him with admiration. And thirdly, he turned to Arius as he spoke, to give pleasure to his admirable and beloved friend. Then shouts of joy burst forth. Every one, from the humblest to the greatest, had had a heavy burden removed from his mind, and the throng had scarcely left the gymnasium when they were again laughing saucily enough, and there was no lack of biting and innocent jests. The fat carpenter Memnon, who furnished the woodwork for your palace, exclaimed close beside me that formerly a dolphin had saved Arius from the pirates. Now Arius was saving Marine, Alexandria, from the robbers. So the sport went on. Philostratus, Barine's first husband, offered the best butt for jests. The agitator had good reason to fear the worst, and now, clad in black mourning robes, ran after Arius, whom but a few months ago he persecuted with the most vindictive hatred, continually repeating this shallow bit of verse: "If he is a wise man, let the wise aid the wise." Reaching home was not easy. The street was swarming with Roman soldiers. They fared well enough, for in the joy of their hearts many a prosperous citizen who saw his property saved invited individual warriors, or even a whole maniple, to the taverns or cook shops, and the stock of wine in Alexandrian cellars will be considerably diminished to-night. Many, as I have already said, had been quartered in the houses with orders to spare the property of the citizens, and it was in this way that the misfortune with which I commenced my narrative befell the grandmother. She died before my departure. All the gates of the city will now stand open to you, and the niece of Arius and her husband will be received with ovations. I don't grudge Barine the good fortune, for the way in which your noble wife, who had cast her spell over me too, flung aside what is always dear to the admired city, beauty, and found on the loneliest of islands a new world in love, is worthy of all admiration and praise. For yourself, I dread new happiness and honours, if they are added to those which fate bestowed upon you in such a wife and your son Pyrrhus. The gods would not be themselves if they did not pursue you with their envy. I have less reason to fear them." "Ungrateful fellow," interrupted his friend, "there will be numerous mortals to grudge you Helena. As for me, I have already felt many a slight foreboding, but we have already paid by no means a small tribute to the divine ones. The lamp is still burning in the sitting-room. Inform the sisters of their grandmother's death, and tell them the pleasant tidings you have brought us, but reserve until the morning a description of the terrible scenes you witnessed. We will not spoil their sleep. Mark my words, Helena's silent grief and her joy at our escape will lighten your heart." And so it proved. True, Gorgias lived over again in his dreams the frightful spectacle witnessed the day before. But when the sun of the second day of August rose in full radiance over Alexandria, and early in the morning boat after boat reached the Serpent Island, landing first Berenike and her nephews, the sons of the honoured philosopher Arius, then clients, officials, and friends of Dion, and former favourite guests of Barine, to greet the young pair and escort them from the refuge which had so long sheltered them back to the city and their midst, new and pleasant impressions robbed the gloomy picture of a large portion of its terrors. Tall Phrixus had rapidly spread the news of the place where Dion and Barine had vanished, and that they had long been happily wedded. Many deemed it well worth a short voyage to see the actors in so strange an adventure and be the first to greet them. Besides, those who knew Barine and her husband were curious to learn how two persons accustomed to the life of a great capital had endured for months such complete solitude. Many feared or expected to see them emaciated and careworn, haggard or sunk in melancholy, and hence there were a number of astonished faces among those whose boats the freedman Pyrrhus guided as pilot through the shallows which protected his island. The return of this rare couple to their home would have afforded an excellent opportunity for gay festivities. Sincerely as the majority of the populace mourned the fate of the Queen, and gravely as the more thoughtful feared for Alexandria's freedom under Roman rule, all rejoiced over the lenient treatment of the city. Their lives and property were safe, and the celebration of festivals had become a life habit with all classes. But the news of the death of Didymus's wife and the illness of the old man, who could not bear up under the loss of his faithful companion, gave Dion a right to refuse any gay welcome at his home. Barine's sorrow was his also, and Didymus died a few days after his wife, with whom he had lived in the bonds of love for more than half a century. People said of a broken heart. So Dion and his young wife entered his beautiful palace with no noisy festivities. Instead of the jubilant Hymenaeus, the voice of his own child greeted him on the threshold. The mourning garments in which Barine welcomed him in the women's apartment reminded him of the envy of the gods which his friend had feared for him, but he often fancied that his mother's statue in the tablinum looked specially happy when the young mistress of the house entered it. Barine, too, felt that her happiness as a wife and mother in her magnificent home would have been overwhelming had not a wise destiny imposed upon her, just at this time, grief for those whom she loved. Dion instantly devoted himself again to the affairs of the city and his own business. He and the woman he loved, who had first become really his own during a time of some privation, had run into the harbour and gazed quietly at the storms of life. The anchor of love, which moored their ship to the solid earth, had been tested in the solitude of the Serpent Island. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24. The fisherman and his family had watched the departure of their beloved guests with sorrowful hearts, and the women had shed many tears, although the sons of Pyrrhus had been dismissed from the fleet and were again helping their father at home as in former times. Besides, Dion had made the faithful freedman a prosperous man and given his daughter Dione a marriage dowry. She was soon to become the wife of the captain of the Epicurus, Archibius's swift galley, whose acquaintance she had made when the vessel, on several occasions, brought Charmian's Nubian maid to the island. Anukis's object in making these visits was not only to see her friend, but to induce him to catch one of the poisonous serpents in the neighbouring island and keep it ready for the Queen. Since Cleopatra had ascertained that no poison caused a less painful death than the fangs of the asp. She had resolved that the bite of one of these reptiles should release her from the burden of life. The clever Ethiopian had thought of inducing her friend Pyrrhus to procure the adder, but it had required all Aesopian skill in persuasion and the touching manner in which she understood how to describe the Queen's terrible situation and severe suffering to conquer the reluctance of the upright man. At last she succeeded in persuading him to measure a queen by a different standard from a woman of the people, and inducing him to arrange the manner and time of conveying the serpent into the well-guarded palace. A signal was to inform him when the decisive hour arrived. After that he was to be ready with the asp in the fish market every day. Probably his service would soon be claimed, for Octavianus's delay was scarcely an indication of a favourable decision of Cleopatra's fate. True, she was permitted to live in royal state at Lochias, and had even been allowed to have the children, the twins, and little Alexander sent back to her with the promise that life and liberty would be granted them. But Caesarion, whose treacherous tutor Rhodon lured him from the journey southward back to Alexandria by all sorts of representations, among them the return of Barine, was held prisoner in his father's temple, where he had sought refuge. This news, and the fact that Octavianus had condemned to death the youth who bore so striking a resemblance to Caesar, had not remained concealed from the unhappy mother. She was also informed of the words in which the philosopher Arius had encouraged Caesar's desire to rid himself of the son of his famous uncle. They referred to the Homeric saying concerning the disadvantage of having many rulers. Everything which Cleopatra desired to know concerning events in the city reached her ears, for she was allowed much liberty, only she was closely watched day and night, and all the servants and officials to whom she granted an audience were carefully searched to keep from her all means of self-destruction. True, it was very evident that she had closed her account with life. Her attempt to take no food and die of starvation must have been noticed. Threats directed against the children, through whom she could be most easily influenced, finally induced her to eat again. Octavianus was informed of all these things, and his conduct proved his anxiety to keep her from suicide. Several Asiatic princes vied with each other in the desire to honour Mark Antony by a magnificent funeral, but Octavianus had allowed Cleopatra to provide the most superb obsequies. In the time of her deepest anguish it afforded her comfort and satisfaction to arrange everything herself, and even perform some offices with her own hands. The funeral had been as gorgeous as the dead man's love of splendour could have desired. Iras and Charmian were often unable to understand how the Queen, who, since Antony's death, had suffered not only from the wounds she had inflicted upon herself in her despair, but also after her baffled attempt at starvation from a slow fever, had succeeded in resisting the severe exertions and mental agitation to which she had been subjected by Antony's funeral. The return of Archibius with the children, however, had visibly reanimated her flagging energy. She often went to Didymus's garden, which was now connected with the palace at Lochias, to watch their work and share whatever interested their young hearts. But the gayest of mothers, who had understood how to enter so thoroughly into her children's pursuits, had now become a sorrowful, grave monitor. Though the lessons she urged upon them were often beautiful and wise, they were little suited to the ages of Archibius's pupils, for they usually referred to death and to questions of philosophy not easily understood by children. She herself felt that she no longer struck the right key, but whenever she tried to change it and jest with them as usual, she could endure the forced gaiety only a short time. A painful revulsion, frequently accompanied by tears, followed, and she was obliged to leave her darlings. The life her foe granted her seemed like an intrusive gift, an oppressive debt, which we desire to pay a troublesome creditor as soon as possible. She seemed calmer and apparently content only when permitted to talk with the companions of her youth concerning bygone days, or with them and Iras of death, and how it would be possible to put an end to an unwelcome existence. After such conversations, Iras and Charmian left her with bleeding hearts. They had long since resolved to share the fate of their royal mistress, whatever it might be. Their common suffering was the bond which again united them in affection. Iras had provided poisoned pins which had speedily destroyed the animals upon which they had been tried. Cleopatra knew of their existence, but she herself preferred the painless death bestowed by the serpent's bite, and it was long since her friends had seen the eyes of their beloved sovereign sparkle so brightly as when Charmian told her that a way had been found to obtain the ureus serpent as soon as it was needed. But it was not yet imperative to adopt the last expedient. Octavianus wished to be considered lenient, and perhaps might still be prevailed upon to grant the Queen and her children a future meet for their royal birth. Cleopatra's reply was an incredulous smile, yet a faint hope, which saved her from despair, began to bud in her soul. Dolabella, an aristocratic Roman, a scion of the noble Cornelius family, was in the Cæsar's train, and had been presented to the Egyptian queen. In former years his father was a friend of Cleopatra, nay, she had placed him under obligations by sending him, after the murder of Julius Cæsar, the military force at her command to be used against Cassius. True, her legions, by messengers from Dolabella himself, were dispatched in another direction, but Cleopatra had not withdrawn her favour from Dolabella's father on that account. The latter had known her in Rome before the death of Cæsar, and had enthusiastically described the charms of the bewitching Egyptian sovereign. Though the youth found her only a mourning widow, ill in body and mind, he was so strongly attracted and deeply moved by her beauty, her brilliant intellect, her grace of bearing, her misfortunes and sufferings, that he devoted many hours to her and would have considered it a happiness to render her greater services than circumstances permitted. He often accompanied her to the children, whose hearts had been completely won by his frank, cheerful nature, and so it happened that he soon became one of the most welcome guests at Lochias. He confided without reserve every feeling that stirred his soul to the warm-hearted woman who was so many years his senior, and through him she learned many things connected with Octavianus and his surroundings. Without permitting himself to be used as a tool, he became an advocate for the unfortunate woman whom he so deeply esteemed. In intercourse with her he made every effort to inspire confidence in Octavianus, who favoured him, enjoyed his society, and in whose magnanimity the youth firmly believed. He anticipated the best results from an interview between the Queen and the Cæsar, for he deemed it impossible that the successful conqueror could part untouched, and with no desire to mitigate her sad fate, from the woman who in earlier years had so fascinated his father, and whom he himself, though she might almost have been his mother, deemed peerless in her bewitching and gracious charm. Cleopatra, on the contrary, shrank from meeting the man who had brought so much misfortune upon Mark Antony and herself, and inflicted upon her insults which were only too well calculated to make her doubt his clemency and truth. On the other hand, she could not deny Dolabella's assertion that it would be far less easy for Octavianus to refuse her in person the wishes she cherished for her children's future than through mediators. Proculagus had learned that Antony had named him to the Queen as the person most worthy of her confidence, and more keenly felt the wrong which, as the tool and obedient friend of Octavianus, he had inflicted upon the hapless woman. The memory of his unworthy deed, which history would chronicle, had robbed the sensitive man, the author and patron of budding Roman poetry, of many an hour's sleep, and therefore he also now laboured zealously to oblige the Queen and mitigate her hard fate. He, like the freedman Epaphroditus, who by Caesar's orders watched carefully to prevent any attempt upon her life, seemed to base great hopes on such an interview, and endeavoured to persuade her to request an audience from the Caesar. Archibius said that even in the worst case it could not render the present state of affairs darker. Experience, he said to Charmian, proved that no man of any feeling could wholly resist the charm of her nature, and to him at least she had never seemed more winning than now. Who could have gazed unmoved into the beautiful face, so eloquent in its silent suffering, whose soul would not have been deeply touched by the sorrowful tones of her sweet voice? Besides, her sable mourning robes were so well suited to the slight tinge of melancholy which pervaded her whole aspect. When the fever flushed her cheeks, Archibius, spite of the ravages which grief, anxiety, and fear had made upon her charms, thought that he had never seen her look more beautiful. He knew her thoroughly, and was aware that her desire to follow the man she loved into the realm of death was sincere, nay, that it dominated her whole being. She clung to life only to die as soon as possible. The decision which, after her resolve to build the monument she had recognized in the temple of Berenike as the right one, had become the rule of conduct of her life. Every thought, every conversation led her back to the past. The future seemed to exist no longer. If Archibius succeeded in directing her thoughts to approaching days, she occupied herself wholly with her children's fate. For herself she expected nothing, felt absolved from every duty except the one of protecting herself and her name from dishonour and humiliation. The fact that Octavianus, when he doomed Caesarion to death, permitted the other children to return to her with the assurance that no harm should befall them, proved that he made a distinction between them and his uncle's son, and had no fears that they threatened his own safety. She might expect important results in their favour from an interview with Octavianus, so she at last authorized Proculagus to request an audience. The Imperator's answer came the very same day. It was his place to seek her. So ran the Caesar's message. This meeting must decide her fate. Cleopatra was aware of this, and begged Charmian to remember the asp. Her attendants had been forbidden to leave Lochias, but Epaphroditus permitted them to receive visitors. The Nubians' merry, amusing talk had made friends for her among the Roman guards, who allowed her to pass in and out unmolested. On her return, of course, she was searched with the utmost care, like every one who entered Lochias. The decisive hour was close at hand. Charmian knew what she must do in any event, but there was still one desire for whose fulfilment she longed. She wished to greet Barine and see her boy. To spare Iras, she had hitherto refrained from sending for Dion's wife. The sight of the mother and child might have reopened wounds still unhealed, and she would not inflict this sorrow upon her niece, who for a long time had once more been loyally devoted to her. Octavianus did not hasten to fulfil his assurance, but at the end of a week Proculejus brought the news that he could promise a visit from the Cæsar that afternoon. The Queen was deeply agitated and desired before the interview to pay a visit to her tomb. Iras offered to accompany her, and as Cleopatra intended to remain an hour or longer, Charmian thought it a favourable opportunity to see Barine and her boy. Dion's wife had been informed of her friend's wish, and Anukis, who was to take her to Lochias, did not wait long for the mother and child. Didymus's garden, now the property of the royal children, was the scene of the meeting. In the shade of the familiar trees the young mother sank upon the breast of her faithful friend, and Charmian could not gaze her fill at the boy, or weary of tracing in his features a resemblance to his grandfather Leonax. How much these two women, to whom fate had allotted lives so widely different, found to tell each other! The older felt transported to the past, the younger seemed to have naught save a present rich in blessing and a future green with hope. She had good news to tell of her sister also. Helena had long been the happy wife of Gorgias, who, however, spite of the love with which he surrounded the young mistress of his house, numbered among his most blissful hours those which were devoted to overseeing the progress of the work on the mausoleum where he met Cleopatra. Time flew swiftly to the two women, and it was a painful surprise when one of the eunuchs on guard announced that the Queen had returned. Again Charmian embraced her lover's grandson, blessed him and the young mother, sent messages of remembrance to Dion, begged Barine to think of her affectionately when she had passed from earth, and, if her heart prompted her to the act, to anoint or adorn with a ribbon or flower the tombstone of the woman who had no friend to render her such a service. Deeply moved by the firmness with which Charmian witnessed the approach of death, Barine listened in silence, but suddenly started as the sharp tones of a well-known voice called her friend's name, and as she turned, Iras stood before her. Pallid and emaciated, she looked in her long floating black robes the very incarnation of misery. The sight pierced the heart of the happy wife and mother. She felt as if much of the joy which Iras lacked had fallen to her own lot, and all the grief and woe she had ever endured had been transferred to her foe. She would fain have approached humbly and said something very kind and friendly, but when she saw the tall, haggard woman gazing at her child, and noticed the disagreeable expression which had formerly induced her to compare her to a sharp thorn, a terrible dread of this woman's evil eye, which might harm her boy, seized the mother's heart, and, overwhelmed by an impulse beyond control, she covered his face with her own veil. Iras saw it, and after Barine had answered her question, "Dion's child?" in the affirmative, with a glance beseeching forbearance, the girl drew up her slender figure, saying with arrogant coldness, "What do I care for the child? We have more important matters on our hearts." Then she turned to Charmian to inform her, in the tone of an official announcement, that during the approaching interview the Queen desired her attendance also. Octavianus had appointed sunset for the interview, and it still lacked several hours of the time. The suffering Queen felt wearied by her visit to the mausoleum, where she had implored the spirit of Antony, if he had any power over the conqueror's heart, to induce him to release her from this torturing uncertainty and promise the children a happy fate. To Dolabella, who had accompanied her from the tomb to the palace, she said that she expected only one thing from this meeting, and then, won from him a promise which strengthened her courage and seemed the most precious boon which could be granted at this time. She had expressed the fear that Octavianus would still leave her in doubt. The youth spoke vehemently in Cæsar's defence, and closed with the exclamation, "If he should still keep you in suspense, he would be not only cool and circumspect." "Then," Cleopatra interrupted, "be nobler, be less cruel, and release your father's friend from these tortures. If he does not reveal to me what awaits me, and you learn it, then you will not say no, you cannot refuse me, then yes, you will inform me." Promptly and firmly came the reply, "What have I been able to do for you until now? But I will release you from this torture, if possible." Then he hastily turned his back, that he might not be compelled to see the eunuchs stationed at the palace gate search the garments of the royal captive. His promise sustained the failing courage of the wearied, anxious Queen, and she reclined upon the cushions of a lounge to recover from the exhausting expedition. But she had scarcely closed her eyes when the pavement of the courtyard rang under the hoofs of the 4 horses which bore the Cæsar to Lochias. Cleopatra had not expected the visit so early. She had just been consulting with her attendants about the best mode of receiving him. At first she had been disposed to do so on the throne, clad in her royal attire, but she afterwards thought that she was too ill and weak to bear the heavy ornaments. Besides, the man and successful conqueror would show himself more indulgent and gracious to the suffering woman than to the princess. There was much to palliate the course which she had pursued in former days, and she had carefully planned the defence by which she hoped to influence his calm but not unjust nature. Many things in her favour were contained in the letters from Cæsar and Antony, which, after her husband's death, she had read again and again during so many wakeful nights, and they had just been brought to her. Both Archibius and the Roman Proculejus had counselled her not to receive him entirely alone. The latter did not express his opinion in words, but he knew that Octavianus was more readily induced to noble and lenient deeds when there was no lack of witnesses to report them to the world. It was advisable to provide spectators for the most consummate actor of his day. Therefore the Queen had retained Iras, Charmian, and some of the officials nearest to her person, among them the steward Seleucus, who could give information if any question arose concerning the delivery of the treasure. She had also intended, after she had somewhat recovered from the visit to the tomb, to be robed in fresh garments. This was prevented by the Cæsar's unexpected arrival. Now, even had time permitted, she would have been unable to have her hair arranged. She felt so weak and yet so feverishly excited. The blood coursed hotly through her veins and flushed her cheeks. When told that the Cæsar was close at hand, she had only time to raise herself a little higher on her cushions, push back her hair, and let Iras, with a few hasty touches, adjust the folds of her mourning robes. Had she attempted to advance to meet him, her limbs would have failed to support her. When the Cæsar at last entered, she could greet him only by a wave of her hand, but Octavianus, who had uttered the usual salutations from the threshold, quickly broke the painful silence, saying with a courteous bow, "You summoned me. I came. Every one is subject to beauty, even the victor." Cleopatra's head drooped in shame as she answered distinctly, yet in a tone of modest denial, "I only asked the favour of an audience. I did not summon. I thank you for granting the request. If it is dangerous for man to bow to woman's charms, no peril threatens you here. Beauty cannot withstand tortures such as those which have been imposed on me. Barely can life remain. But you prevented my casting it from me. If you are just, you will grant to the woman whom you would not permit to die an existence whose burden will not exceed her power to endure." The Cæsar again bowed silently and answered courteously, "I intend to make it worthy of you." "Then," cried Cleopatra impetuously, "release me from this torturing uncertainty. You are not one of the men who never look beyond to day and to morrow." "You are thinking," said Octavianus harshly, "of one who perhaps would still be among us, if with wiser caution." Cleopatra's eyes, which hitherto had met the victor's cold gaze with modest entreaty, flashed angrily, and a majestic "Let the past rest" interrupted him. But she soon mastered the indignation which had stirred her passionate blood, and in a totally different tone, not wholly free from gentle persuasion, she continued: "The provident intellect of the man whose nod the universe obeys grasped the future as well as the present. Must not he therefore have decided the children's fate ere he consented to see their mother? The only obstacle in your path, the son of your great uncle, his doom was a necessity," interrupted the conqueror in a tone of sincere regret. "As I mourned Antony, I grieve for the unfortunate boy." "If that is true," replied Cleopatra eagerly, "it does honour to the kindness of your heart. When Proculejus wrested the dagger from my grasp, he blamed me because I attributed to the most clement of conquerors harshness and implacability." "Two qualities," the Cæsar protested, "which are wholly alien to my nature." "And which, even if you possessed them, you neither could nor ought to use," cried Cleopatra, "if you really mean the beautiful words you so often utter, that, as the nephew and heir of the great Julius Cæsar, you intend to walk in his footsteps. Cæsarion, there is his bust, was the image in every feature of his father, your illustrious model. To me, the hapless woman now awaiting my sentence, from his nephew's lips, the gods granted, as the most precious of all gifts, the love of your divine uncle. And what love! The world knew not what I was to his great heart. But my wish to defend myself from misconception bids me show it to you, his heir. From you I expect my sentence. You are the judge. These letters are my strongest defence. I rely upon them to show myself to you as I was and am, not as envy and slander describe me. The little ivory casket, Iras, it contains the precious proofs of Cæsar's love, his letters to me." She raised the lid with trembling hands, and, as these mementoes carried her back to the past, she continued in lower tones: "Among all my treasures this simple little coffer has been for half a lifetime my most valued jewel. He gave it to me. It was in the midst of the fierce contest here at the Bruchium." Then, while unfolding the first roll, she directed Octavianus's attention to it and the remainder of the contents of the little casket, exclaiming: "Silent pages, yet how eloquent! Each one a peerless picture, the powerful thinker, the man of action, who permits his restless intellect to repose and suffers his heart to overflow with the love of youth. Were I vain, Octavianus, I might call each one of these letters a trophy of victory, an Olympic garland. The woman to whom Julius Cæsar owned his subjugation might well hold her head higher than the unhappy vanquished queen who saved the permission to die." "Do not part with the letters," said Octavianus kindly. "Who can doubt that they are a precious treasure?" "The most precious, and at the same time the advocate of the accused," replied Cleopatra eagerly. "On them, as you have already heard, rests my vindication. I will commence with their contents. How terrible it is to make what is sacred to us, and intended only to elevate our own hearts, serve a purpose, to do what has always been repugnant to us. But I need an advocate, and, Octavianus, these letters will restore to the wretched, suffering beggar the dignity and majesty of the Queen. The world knows but two powers to which Julius Cæsar bowed, the thrall of the pitiable woman on this couch, and of all-conquering death. An unpleasant fellowship, but I do not shrink from it, for death robbed him of life, and from my hand I ask only a brief moment. How gladly I would spare myself my own praises, and you the necessity of listening to them. Yes, here it is, through you.
You irresistible woman," he writes, "I learned for the first time, after youth was over, how beautiful life can be." Cleopatra, as she spoke, handed Cæsar the letter, but while she was still searching hastily for another, he returned the first, saying, "I understand only too well your reluctance to allow such confidential effusions to play the part of defender. I can imagine their purport, and they shall influence me, as if I had read them all. However eloquent they may be, they are needless witnesses. Is any written testimony required in behalf of charms whose magic is still potent?" A bewitching smile, which seemed like a confirmation of the haughty young conqueror's flattering words, flitted over Cleopatra's face. Octavianus noticed it. This woman indeed possessed enthralling charms, and he felt the slight flush that suffused his cheeks. This unhappy captive, this suffering supplicant, could still draw into her net any man who did not possess the cool watchfulness which panoplied his soul. Was it the marvellous melody of her voice, the changeful lustre of her tearful eyes, the aristocratic grace of the noble figure, the exquisite symmetry of the hands and feet, the weakness of the prostrate sufferer, strangely blended with truly royal majesty? Or the thought that love for her had found earth's greatest and loftiest men with indissoluble fetters, which lent this fragile woman, who had long since passed the boundaries of youth, so powerful a spell of attraction? At any rate, however certain of himself he might be, he must guard his feelings. He understood how to bridle passion far better than the uncle who was so greatly his superior. Yet it was of the utmost importance to keep her alive, and therefore to maintain her belief in his admiration. He wished to show the world and the great Queen of the East, who had just boasted of conquering, like death, even the most mighty, its own supremacy as man and victor. But he must also be gentle, in order not to endanger the object for which he wanted her. She must accompany him to Rome. She and her children promised to render his triumph the most brilliant and memorable one which any conqueror had ever displayed to the Senate and the people. In a light tone, which, however, revealed the emotion of his soul, he answered: "My illustrious uncle was known as a friend of fair women. His stern life was crowned with flowers by many hands, and he acknowledged these favours verbally, and perhaps, as he did to you in all these letters, with the reed. His genius was greater, at any rate more many-sided and mobile, than mine. He succeeded, too, in pursuing different objects at the same time with equal devotion. I am wholly absorbed in the cares of state, of government and war. I feel grateful when I can permit our poets to adorn my leisure for a brief space. Overburdened with toil, I have no time to yield myself captive, as my uncle did, in these very rooms, to the most charming of women. If I could follow my own will, you would be the first from whom I would seek the gifts of Eros, but it may not be. We Romans learn to curb even the most ardent wishes when duty and morality command. There is no city in the world where half so many gods are worshipped as here. And what strange deities are numbered among them! It needs a special effort of the intellect to understand them. But the simple duties of the domestic hearth, they are too prosaic for you Alexandrians, who imbibe philosophy with your mother's milk. What marvel if I looked for them in vain? True, they would find little satisfaction, our household gods, I mean, here, where the rigid demands of Hymen are mute before the ardent pleadings of Eros. Marriage is scarcely reckoned among the sacred things of life. But this opinion seems to displease you." "Because it is false!" cried Cleopatra, repressing with difficulty a fresh outburst of indignation. "Yet, if I see aright, your reproach is aimed only at the bond which united me to the man who was called your sister's husband. But I would gladly remain silent, but you force me to speak, and I will do so, though your own friend Proculejus is signing to me to be cautious. I, Cleopatra, was the wife of Mark Antony, according to the customs of this country, when you wedded him to the widow of Marcellus, who had scarcely closed his eyes. Not she, but I was the deserted wife, I, to whom his heart belonged until the hour of his death, not the wedded. Here her voice fell. She had yielded to the passionate impulse which urged her to express her feelings in the matter, and now continued in a tone of gentle explanation: "I know that you propose this alliance solely for the peace and welfare of Rome." "To guard both, and to spare the blood of tens of thousands," Octavianus added, with proud decision. "Your clear brain perceived the true state of affairs. If, spite of the grave importance of these motives, you but what voices would not that of the heart silence with you women? The man, the Roman, succeeded in closing his ears to its siren song. Were it otherwise, I would never have chosen for my sister a husband by whom I knew her happiness would be so ill guarded. I would, as I have already said, be unable to master my own admiration of the loveliest of women. But I ought scarcely to boast of that. I fear that a heart like yours opens less quickly to the modest Octavianus than to a Julius Caesar or the brilliant Mark Antony. Yet I may be permitted to confess that perhaps I might have avoided conducting this unhappy war against my friend to the end under my own guidance and appearing myself in Egypt, had I not been urged by the longing to see once more the woman who had dazzled my boyish eyes. Now, in my mature manhood, I desired to comprehend those marvellous gifts of mind, that matchless sagacity. "Sagacity?" interrupted the Queen, shrugging her shoulders mournfully. "You possess a far greater share of what is commonly called by that name. My fate proves it. The pliant intellect which the gods bestowed on me would ill sustain the test in this hour of anguish. But if you really care to learn what mental power Cleopatra once possessed, relieve me of this terrible burden of uncertainty and grant me a position in life which will permit my paralyzed soul to move freely once more." "It depends solely on yourself," Octavian eagerly responded, "to make your future life not only free from care, but beautiful." "On me?" asked Cleopatra in astonishment. "Our weal and woe are in your hands alone. I am modest and ask nothing save to know what you intend for our future, what you mean by the lot which you term beautiful." "Nothing less," replied the Cæsar quietly, "than what seems to lie nearest to your own heart, a life of that freedom of soul to which you aspire." The breath of the agitated Queen began to come more quickly, and, no longer able to control the impatience which overpowered her, she exclaimed: "With the assurance of your favour on your lips, you refuse to discuss the question which interests me beyond any other, for which, if any, you must have been prepared when you came here?" "Reproaches?" asked Octavianus, with feigned surprise. "Would it not rather be my place to complain? It is precisely because I am thoroughly sincere in the friendly disposition which you read aright from my words that some of your measures cannot fail to wound me. Your treasures were to be committed to the flames. It would be unfair to expect tokens of friendship from the vanquished, but can you deny that even the bitterest hatred could scarcely succeed in devising anything more hostile?" "Let the past rest. Who would not seek in war to diminish the enemy's booty?" pleaded the Queen in a soothing tone. But as Octavianus delayed his answer, she continued more eagerly: "It is said that the ibex in the mountains, when in mortal peril, rushes upon the hunter and hurls him with it down the precipice. The same impulse is natural to human beings, and praiseworthy, I think, in both. Forget the past, as I will try to do. I repeat with uplifted hands, say that you will permit the sons whom I gave to Antony to ascend the Egyptian throne, not under their mother's guardianship, but that of Rome, and grant me freedom wherever I may live, and I will gladly transfer to you, down to the veriest trifles, all the property and treasures I possess." She clenched her little hand impatiently under the folds of her robe as she spoke, but Octavianus lowered his eyes, saying carelessly: "In war the victor disposes of the property of the vanquished. But my heart restrains me from applying the universal law to you, who are so far above ordinary mortals. Your wealth is said to be vast, though the foolish war which Antony, with your aid so greatly prolonged, devoured vast sums. In this country squandered gold seems like the grass, which, when mowed, springs up anew." "You speak," replied Cleopatra, more and more deeply incensed, with proud composure, "of the treasures which my ancestors, the powerful monarchs of a wealthy country, amassed during 300 years for their noble race and for the adornment of the women of their line. Parsimony did not accord with the generosity and lofty nature of an Antony, yet avarice itself would not deem the portion still remaining insignificant. Every article is registered." While speaking, she took a manuscript from the hand of Seleucus and passed it to Octavianus, who, with a slight bend of the head, received it in silence. But he had scarcely begun to read it when the steward, a little corpulent man with twinkling eyes half buried in his fat cheeks, raised his short forefinger, pointed insolently at the Queen, and asserted that she was trying to conceal some things, and had ordered him not to place them on the list. Every tinge of colour faded from the lips and cheeks of the agitated and passionate woman. Tortured by feverish impatience and no longer able to control her emotions, she raised herself and with her own dainty hand struck the accuser, whom she had lifted from poverty and obscurity to his present high position, again and again in the face, till Octavianus, with a smile of superiority, begged her, much as the man deserved his punishment, to desist. The unfortunate woman, thus thrown off her guard, flung herself back on her couch, and, panting for breath, with tears streaming from her eyes, sobbed aloud, declaring that in the presence of such unendurable insult, such contemptible baseness, she fairly loathed herself. Then, pressing her clenched hands upon her temples, she exclaimed: "Before the eyes of the foe, my royal dignity, which I have maintained all my life, falls from me like a borrowed mantle. Yet what am I? What shall I be to morrow? What later? But who beneath the sun, who has warm blood in his veins, can preserve his composure when juicy grapes are held before his thirsting lips to be withdrawn, as from Tantalus, ere he can taste them? You came hither with the assurance of your favour, but the flattering words of promise which you bestowed upon the unhappy woman were probably only the drops of poppy juice given to soothe the ravings of fever. Was the favour which you permitted me to see and anticipate for the future merely intended to delude a miserable—" But she went no further. Octavianus, with dignified bearing and loud, clear tones, interrupted: "Whoever believes the heir of Cæsar capable of shamefully deceiving a noble woman, a queen, the object of his illustrious uncle's love, insults and wounds him. But the just anger which overmastered you may serve as your apology. I," he added in a totally different tone, "I might even have cause to be grateful for this indignation, and to wish for another opportunity to witness the outbreak of passion, though in its unbridled fierceness. The royal lioness is scarcely aware of her own beauty when the tempest of wrath sweeps her away. What must she be when it is love that constrains the flame of her glowing soul to burst into a blaze?" "Her glowing soul," Cleopatra eagerly repeated, and the desire awoke to subjugate this man who had so confidently boasted of his power of resistance. Though he might be stronger than many others, he certainly was not invincible, and, aware of her still unbroken sway over the hearts of men, her eyes sparkled with the alluring radiance of love, and a bewitching smile brightened her face. The young Imperator's heart began to chafe under the curb and to beat more quickly. His cheeks flushed and paled by turns. How she gazed at him! What if she loved the nephew as she had once loved the uncle, who through her had learned what bliss life can offer? It must be happiness to kiss those lips, to be clasped in those exquisite arms, to hear one's own name tenderly spoken by those musical tones. Even the magnificent marble statue of Ariadne, which he had seen in Athens, had not displayed to his gaze lines more beautiful than those of the woman reclining on yonder pillows. Who could venture to speak in her presence of vanished charms? Ah, no! The spell which had conquered Julius Cæsar was as vivid, as potent as ever. He himself felt its power. He was young, and after such unremitting exertions, he, too, yearned to quaff the nectar of the noblest joys, to steep body and soul in peerless bliss. So, with a hasty movement, he took one step towards her couch, resolved to grasp her hands and raise them to his lips. His ardent gaze answered hers, but surprised by the power which, though so heavily burdened with physical and mental suffering, she still possessed over the strongest and coldest of men, she perceived what was passing in his soul, and a smile of triumph, blended with the most bitter contempt, hovered around her beautiful lips. Should she dupe him into granting her wishes by feigning love for the first time? Should she yield to the man who had insulted her in order to induce him to accord the children their rights? Should she, to gratify her lover's foe, relinquish the sacred grief which was drawing her after him, give posterity and her children the right to call her, instead of the most loyal of the loyal, a dishonoured woman who sold herself for power? To all these questions came a prompt denial. The single stride which Octavianus had made towards her, his eyes aflame with love, gave her the right to feel that she had vanquished the victor, and the proud delight of triumph was too plainly reflected in her mobile features to escape the penetrating, distrustful gaze of the subjugated Cæsar. But he had scarcely perceived what threatened him, and remembered her words concerning his famous uncle's surrender only to her and to death, when he succeeded in conquering his quickly kindled senses. Blushing at his own weakness, he averted his eyes from the Queen, and when he met those of Proculejus and the other witnesses of the scene, he realized the abyss on whose verge he stood. He had half succumbed to the danger of losing by a moment's weakness the fruit of great sacrifices and severe exertions. His expressive eyes, which had just rested rapturously upon a beautiful woman, now scanned the spectators with the stern glance of a monarch, and apparently wishing to moderate an excess of flattering recognition which might be misinterpreted, he said in an almost pedagogical tone: "Yet we would rather see the noble lioness in the majestic repose which best suits all sovereigns. It is difficult for a calm, deliberate nature like mine to understand an ardent, quickly kindling heart." Cleopatra had watched this sudden transition with more surprise than disappointment. Octavianus had half surrendered to her, but recovered his self-command in time, and a man of his temperament does not readily succumb twice to a danger which he barely escaped, and this was well. He should learn that he had misunderstood the glance which fired his heart, so she answered distantly, with majestic dignity: "Misery such as mine quenches all ardour, and love, woman's heart is ever open to it, save where it has lost the desire for power and pleasure. You are young and happy, therefore your soul still yearns for love. I know that, though not for mine. To me, on the contrary, one suitor only is welcome, he with the lowered torch, whom you keep aloof from me. With him alone is to be found the boon for which this soul has longed from childhood, painless peace. You smile. My past gives you the right to do so. I will not lessen it. Each individual lives his or her own life. Few understand the changes of their own existence, far less those of a stranger's. The world has witnessed how peace fled from my path, or I from hers, and yet I see the possibility of finding the way. I am safe from the only things which would debar me from those joys, humiliation and disgrace." Here she hesitated. Then, as if in explanation, continued in the sweetest tones at her command: "Your generosity, I think, will guard from these two foes the woman whom just now I did not fail to see it you considered worthy of a more than gracious glance. I shall treasure it among memories which will never fade. But now, illustrious Imperator, tell me, what is your decision concerning me and the children? What may we hope from your favour?" "That Octavianus will be more and more warmly animated by the desire to accord you and yours a worthy destiny, the more firmly you expect that he will attest his generosity. And if I fulfil this desire and expect from you everything that is great and noble, the condition is not difficult. What proofs of your graciousness will then await us? Paint them with all the fervour of that vivid power of imagination which interpreted even my glance in your favour, and devised the marvels by which you rendered the greatest and most brilliant man in Rome the happiest of mortals. But, by Zeus, it is the 4th hour after noonday." A glance from the window had caused the exclamation. Then, pressing his hand upon his heart, he continued in a tone of the most sincere regret: "How gladly I would prolong this fascinating conversation, but important matters, which unfortunately cannot be deferred, summon me." "And your answer?" cried Cleopatra, panting for breath and gazing at him with eyes full of expectation. "Must I repeat it?" he asked with impatient haste. "Very well, then. In return for implicit confidence on your part, favour, forgiveness, cordiality, every consideration which you can justly desire, your heart is so rich in warmth of feeling, grant me but a small share of it, and ask tangible gifts in return. They are already bestowed." Then, greeting her like a friend who is reluctant to say farewell, he hastily left the apartment. "Gone! Gone!" cried Iras as the door closed behind him. "An eel that slips from the hand which strives to hold him." "Northern ice," added Cleopatra gloomily, as Charmian aided her to find a more comfortable position, "as smooth as it is cold. There is nothing more to hope." "Yes, my royal mistress, yes," Iras eagerly protested. "Dolabella is waiting for him in the Philadelphus courtyard. From him you have his promise we shall learn what Octavianus has in store for you." In truth, the Cæsar did find the youth at the first gate of the palace, inspecting his superb Cyrenian horses. "Magnificent animals!" cried Octavianus. "A gift from the city. Will you drive with me? A very remarkable woman." "Isn't she?" asked Dolabella eagerly. "Undoubtedly," replied the Cæsar. "But though she might almost be your mother, an uncommonly dangerous one for youths of your age. What a melting voice! What versatility! What fervour! And yet such regal grace in every movement! But I wish to stifle, not to fan, the spark which perhaps has already fallen into your heart, and the play, the farce which she just enacted before me in the midst of most serious matters." He uttered a low, short laugh, but Dolabella exclaimed expectantly: "You rarely laugh, but this conversation apparently excites your mirth. So the result was satisfactory?" "Let us hope so. I was as gracious to her as possible." "That is delightful. May I know in what manner your kindness and wisdom have shaped her future? Or rather, what did you promise the vanquished Queen?" "My favour, if she will trust me." "Proculejus and I will continue to strengthen her confidence, and if we succeed, then, as I have said, she will have my favour, a generous abundance of favour. But her future destiny, what fate will you bestow on her and her children? Whatever the degree of her confidence deserves." Here he hesitated, for he met Dolabella's earnest, troubled gaze, which was blended with a shade of reproach. Octavianus desired to retain the enthusiastic admiration of the youth, who perhaps was destined to lofty achievements, so he continued in a confidential tone: "To you, my young friend, I can venture to speak more frankly. I will gladly grant the most aspiring wishes of this fascinating and, I repeat, very remarkable woman. But first I need her for my triumph. The Romans would have cause to reproach me if I deprived them of the sight of this queen, this peerless woman, in many respects the first of her time. We shall soon set out for Syria. The Queen and her children I shall send in 3 days to Rome. If, in the triumphal procession there, she creates the sensation I anticipate from a spectacle so worthy of admiration, she shall learn how I reward those who oblige me." Dolabella had listened in silence. When the Cæsar entered the carriage, he requested permission to remain behind. Octavianus drove alone eastward to the camp, where, in the vicinity of the Hippodrome, men were surveying the ground on which the suburb of Nicopolis, City of Victory, was to be built to commemorate for future generations the victory of the first emperor over Antony and Cleopatra. It grew, but never attained any great importance. The noble Cornelius gazed indignantly after his sovereign's fiery steeds. Then, drawing up his stately figure to its full height, he entered the palace with a firm step. The act might cost him his life, but he would do what he believed to be his duty to the noble woman who had honoured him with her friendship. This rare sovereign was too good to feast the eyes of the rabble. A few minutes later Cleopatra knew her impending ignominy. End of chapter 24.
Chapter 25. The next morning the Queen had many whispered conversations with Charmian, and the latter with Anukis. The day before, Archibius's gardener had brought to his master's sister some unusually fine figs, which grew in the old garden of Epicurus. This fruit was also mentioned, and Anukis went to Canopus, and thence in the steward's carriage, with a basket of the very best ones, to the fish market. There she had a great deal to say to Pyrrhus, and the freedman went to his boat with the figs. Shortly after the Nubian's return, the Queen came back to the palace from the mausoleum. Her features bore an impress of resolution usually alien to them. Nay, the firmly compressed lips gave them an expression of actual sternness. She knew what duty required, and regarded her approaching end as an inevitable necessity. Death seemed to her like a journey which she must take in order to escape the most terrible disgrace. Besides, life after the death of Antony was no longer the same. It had been only a tiresome delay, and waiting for the children's sake. The visit to the tomb had been intended, as it were, to announce her coming to her husband. She had remained a long time in the silent hall, where she had garlanded the coffin with flowers, kissed it, talked to the dead man as if he were still alive, and told him that the day had come when what he had mentioned in his will as the warmest desire of his heart, to rest beside her in the same tomb, would be fulfilled. Among the thousand forms of suffering which had assailed her, nothing had seemed so hard to bear as to be deprived of his society and love. Then she had gone into the garden, embraced and kissed the children, and entreated them to remember her tenderly. Her purpose had not been concealed from Archibius, but Charmian had told him the menace of the future, and he approved her decision. By the exertion of all his innate strength of will, he succeeded in concealing the grief which rent his faithful heart. She must die. The thought of seeing her adorn the triumphal procession of Octavianus was unbearable to him also. Her thanks and entreaties to be an affectionate guardian to the children were received with an external calmness which afterwards seemed to him utterly incomprehensible. When she spoke of her approaching meeting with her lover, he asked whether she had entirely abandoned the teachings of Epicurus, who believed that death absolutely ended existence. Cleopatra eagerly assented, saying, "Absence of pain has ceased to appear to me the chief earthly blessing, since I have known that love does not bring pleasure only, since I have learned that pain is the inseparable companion of love. I will not give it up, nor will I part from my lover. Whoever experiences what fate has allotted to me has learned to know other gods than those whom the Master described as dwelling happily in undisturbed repose. Rather eternal torture in another world, united to the man I love, than painless, joyless, mere existence in a desolate, incomprehensible, unknown region. You will be the last to teach the children to yearn for freedom from pain." "Because, like you," cried Archibius, "I have learned how great a blessing is love, and that love is pain." As he spoke, he bent over her hand to kiss it, but she took his temples between her hands and, bending hastily, pressed her lips on his broad brow. Then his self-control vanished, and, sobbing aloud, he hurried back to the children. Cleopatra gazed after him with a sorrowful smile, and, leaning on Charmian's arm, she entered the palace. There she was bathed and robed in costly mourning garments, reclined among her cushions to take breakfast, which was usually served at this hour. Iras and Charmian shared it. When dessert was carried in, the Nubian brought a basket filled with delicious figs. A peasant, she told Epaphroditus, who was watching the meal, had given them to her because they were so remarkably fine. Some had already been snatched by the guards. The Queen and her companions ate a little of the fruit, and Proculejus, who had come to greet Cleopatra, was also persuaded to taste one of the finest figs. At the end of the meal Cleopatra wished to rest. The Roman gentlemen and the guards retired. At last the women were alone and gazed at each other silently. Charmian timidly lifted the upper layer of the fruit, but the Queen said mournfully: "The wife of Antony, dragged through the streets of Rome behind the victor's chariot, a spectacle for the populace and envious matrons." Then, starting up, she exclaimed: "What a thought! Was it too great for Octavianus, or too petty? He who so loudly boasts his knowledge of mankind expects this impossibility from the woman who revealed her inmost soul to him as fully as he concealed his from her. We will show him how small is his comprehension of human nature and teach him modesty." A contemptuous smile flitted over her beautiful lips as, with rapid movements, she flung handful after handful of figs on the table till she saw something stirring under the fruit, and, with a sigh of relief, exclaimed under her breath: "There it is!" As with hasty resolution she held out her arm towards the asp, which hissed at her. While gazing intently at the movements of the viper, which seemed afraid to fulfil the dread office, she said to her attendants: "I thank you for everything. Be calm. You know, Iras, it will cause no pain. They say it is like falling asleep." Then she shuddered slightly, adding: "Death is a solemn thing, yet it must be. Why does the serpent delay? There, I will keep firm. Ambition and love were the moving forces of my life. Men shall praise my memory. I follow you, Mark Antony." Charmian bent over the left arm of her royal mistress, which hung loosely at her side, and, weeping aloud, covered it with kisses, while Cleopatra, watching the motions of the asp still more closely, added: "The peace of our garden of Epicurus will begin to day. Whether it will be painless, who can tell? Yet, there I agree with Archibius, life's greatest joy, love, is blended with pain, as yonder branch of exquisite roses from Dolabella, the last gift of friendship, has its sharp thorns. I think you have both experienced this. The twins and my little darling, when they think of their mother and her end, will not the children—" Here she uttered a low cry. The asp had struck its fangs into the upper part of her arm like an icy flash of lightning, and a few instants later Cleopatra sank back upon her pillows, lifeless. Iras, pale but calm, pointed to her, saying: "Like a sleeping child, bewitching even in death, fate itself was constrained to do her will and fulfil the last desire of the great Queen, the victorious woman whom no heart resisted. Its decree shatters the presumptuous plan of Octavianus. The victor will show himself to the Romans without thee, thou dear one." Sobbing violently, she bent over the inanimate form, closed the eyes, and kissed the lips and brow. The weeping Charmian did the same. Then the footsteps of men were heard in the anteroom, and Iras, who was the first to notice them, cried eagerly: "The moment is approaching. I am glad it is close at hand. Does it not seem to you also as if the very sun in the heavens was darkened?" Charmian nodded assent and whispered: "The poison?" "Here," replied Iras calmly, holding out a plain pin. "One little prick, and the deed will be done. Look! But no, you once inflicted the deepest suffering upon me. You know, Dion, the playmate of my childhood. It is forgiven. But now you will do me a kindness. You will spare my using the pen myself, will you not? I will repay you. If you wish, my hand shall render you the same service." Charmian clasped her niece to her heart, kissed her, pricked her arm lightly, and gave her the other pen, saying, "Now it is your turn." Our hearts were filled with love for one who understood how to bestow it as none other ever did, and our love was returned. What matters all else that we sacrificed? "Those on whom the sun shines need no other light. Love is pain," she said in dying, "but this pain, especially that of renunciation for love's sake, bears with it a joy, an exquisite joy, which renders death easy. To me it seems as if it were merely following the Queen to Oh, that hurt!" Iras's pen had pricked her. The poison did its work quickly. Iras was seized with giddiness and could scarcely stand. Charmian had just sunk on her knees when someone knocked loudly at the closed door, and the voices of Epaphroditus and Proculejus imperiously demanded admittance. When no answer followed, the lock was hastily burst open. Charmian was found lying pale and distorted at the feet of her royal mistress, but Iras, tottering and half stupefied by the poison, was adjusting the diadem which had slipped from its place. To keep from her beloved Queen everything that could detract from her beauty had been her last care. Enraged, fairly frantic with wrath, the Romans rushed towards the women. Epaphroditus had seen Iras still occupied in arranging Cleopatra's ornaments. Now he endeavoured to raise her companion, saying reproachfully, "Charmian, was this well done?" Summoning her last strength, she answered in a faltering voice, "Perfectly well, and worthy a descendant of Egyptian kings." Her eyes closed, but Proculejus, the author, who had gazed long with deep emotion into the beautiful, proud face of the Queen whom he had so greatly wronged, said, "No other woman on earth was ever so admired by the greatest, so loved by the loftiest. Her fame echoed from nation to nation throughout the world. It will continue to resound from generation to generation. But however loudly men may extol the bewitching charm, the fervour of the love which survived death, her intellect, her knowledge, the heroic courage with which she preferred the tomb to ignominy, the praise of these two must not be forgotten. Their fidelity deserves it. By their marvellous end they unconsciously erected the most beautiful monument to their mistress. For what genuine goodness and lovableness must have been possessed by the woman who, after the greatest reverses, made it seem more desirable to those nearest to her person to die than to live without her? The Roman's exclamation and the answer of the loyal, dying Charmian are taken literally from Plutarch's narrative. The news of the death of their beloved, admired sovereign transformed Alexandria into a house of mourning. Obsequies of unprecedented magnificence and solemnity, at which many tears of sincere grief flowed, honoured her memory. One of Octavianus's most brilliant plans was frustrated by her death, and he had raved furiously when he read the letter in which Cleopatra, with her own hand, informed him of her intention to die. But he owed it to his reputation for generosity to grant her a funeral worthy of her rank. To the dead, who had ceased to be dangerous, he was ready to show an excess of magnanimity. The treatment which he accorded to Cleopatra's children also won the world's admiration. His sister Octavia received them into her own house and entrusted their education to Archibius. When the order to destroy the statues of Antony and Cleopatra was issued, Octavianus gave his contemporaries another proof of his disposition to be lenient, for he ordered that the numerous statues of the Queen in Alexandria and Egypt should be preserved. True, he had been influenced by the large sum of 2,000 talents paid by an Alexandrian to secure this act of generosity. Archibius was the name of the rare friend who had impoverished himself to render this service to the memory of the beloved dead. In later times, the statues of the unfortunate Queen adorned the places where they had been erected. The sarcophagi of Cleopatra and Mark Antony, by whose side rested Iras and Charmian, were constantly heaped with flowers and offerings to the dead. The women of Alexandria especially went to the tomb of their beloved queen as if it were a pilgrimage. But in after days faithful mourners also came from a distance to visit it, among them the children of the famous lovers whom death here united, Cleopatra, Selene, now the wife of the learned Numidian Prince Juba, Helios, Antony, and Alexander, who had reached manhood. Their friend and teacher Archibius accompanied them. He taught them to hold their mother's memory dear, and had so reared them that in their maturity he could lead them with head erect to the sarcophagus of the friend who had confided them to his charge. End of chapter 25. End of Cleopatra by Georg Ebers, translated by Mary J. Safford.